It was late October when I decided to take a break from the noise of the city. The office had been crushing me lately, endless deadlines, calls, and the constant buzz of people everywhere. I just needed to get away, somewhere quiet, somewhere simple. I found a small cabin for rent out in the mountains through a local listing. Nothing fancy, no internet, no cell service, just 4 walls, a wood stove, and miles of forest around it. It sounded perfect. I packed a small bag, some clothes, food, water, a flashlight, matches, a pocket knife, and a book I'd been meaning to read. I told myself I'd spend a week alone, away from everything. When I pulled up the dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was already low, casting long shadows through the bare trees. The cabin stood at the edge of a small clearing, the forest thick and dark beyond. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Wet pine needles, old wood, and something else. Something earthy and sharp, like damp dirt and decayed leaves. The cabin's porch creaked as I stepped onto it, and I pushed open the heavy door. Inside, it smelled faintly of smoke and dust. The walls were made of rough logs, the floor covered in worn planks. A small kitchen stove stood cold in one corner. A wooden table with 2 chairs sat near a window that looked out onto the trees. I set my bags down and went outside to gather some firewood. The woods felt dense, quiet but alive. Every sound seemed louder, the crunch of leaves under my boots, the rustling of branches high above. I noticed the sun dipping lower, and I hurried back inside to light the stove. The dry wood caught quickly, and soon a warm orange glow filled the room. As night fell, I sat near the fire, reading my book by the flickering light. The windows were foggy, and outside, the forest turned black. First, everything was peaceful. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional call of a distant bird. But as the night deepened, I started to hear other noises. At first, it was a soft tapping against the window. I thought maybe a branch swaying in the wind. The wind had picked up, cold and sharp, making the cabin creak and groan. But the tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I set the book down and stared out the window, trying to see what it was. Dark shapes moved just beyond the glass. A branch? Maybe. But then I saw something shift, a shadow or maybe a figure. It stood just beyond the edge of the clearing, at the tree line. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart picked up. I told myself it was nothing, just my eyes playing tricks. I closed the curtains and turned back to the fire. Still, the feeling didn't leave me. Something was watching. I sat still for a long time, listening. The wind moaned outside, and somewhere far off, an animal howled. My mind went to bears or coyotes, but the sound was different, too low, too human. Sleep came fitfully. I woke several times to strange noises. Branches snapping, distant footsteps crunching through leaves, the occasional heavy breathing that seemed too close. Each time I opened my eyes, the room was empty, the fire dying low. Morning was a relief, but I felt exhausted. I decided to explore the area a bit, hoping to distract myself. The clearing stretched for maybe 100 yards before the thick forest began again. I walked around the cabin, noticing old tracks in the soft earth. Animal prints, maybe deer, but some were different. Larger, heavier, with a strange pattern. I followed them a short distance into the trees. They stopped abruptly. The forest was silent, too silent. No birds sang, no squirrels chattered. Just the soft whisper of the wind through the branches. I shivered and turned back. Back at the cabin, I tried to keep busy. I cleaned the kitchen, stacked firewood, and tried to shake the feeling of being watched. But as dusk fell again, the fear crept back in. Outside, I heard footsteps moving slowly through the underbrush. Not quick like an animal fleeing, but slow, deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The beams sliced through the darkness, lighting up thick trunks and undergrowth. I called out, but no answer came. The footsteps stopped. I stood still, listening. Then, suddenly, a low growl echoed from the trees. I froze. It wasn't a bear or a coyote. The sound was too low, too close, and it had a strange, guttural quality. My mind raced through the possibilities. Wild animal, someone hiding nearby, maybe a hunter. I turned back to the cabin and bolted inside, locking the door. That night was worse. Every noise outside felt like it was getting closer. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the soft scrape of something dragging over the ground. I stayed near the stove, fire burning bright, gripping my knife. At one point, something pounded on the door, a heavy, forceful banging that shook the walls. I didn't open, couldn't. When dawn finally broke, I was numb and tired. The pounding stopped. Outside, I saw deep marks in the ground, huge footprints, uneven and heavy. They led from the woods to the cabin and then disappeared into the trees again. I didn't know what to make of it. My first thought was to leave immediately, but the nearest town was hours away by foot, and I had no car. The dirt road was too rough for me to risk walking it alone in the dark. The next day, I stayed inside, trying to keep the fire going and avoid looking outside. But the feeling of being trapped, watched, and hunted never left me. At night, the pounding on the door returned, sometimes the sound of heavy breathing just outside the windows. On the third night, I realized I was running low on firewood. I had to go out and get more. The forest was quiet when I stepped outside, the moon bright and cold overhead. I moved quickly, picking dry branches and stacking them near the porch. But as I bent down, I heard a rustle behind me. I spun around, flashlight flashing into the trees. Nothing, just shadows. But the rustling grew louder, closer. I backed toward the cabin, feeling something watching me from the dark. Suddenly, a figure stepped into the clearing. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing dirty clothes and a hood. His face was hard to see in the moonlight, but his eyes caught the beam of my flashlight. They were cold and empty. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching. My heart pounded, but I held the flashlight steady and slowly stepped back toward the cabin. He didn't move, just stayed at the edge of the clearing. I slammed the door shut and locked it behind me. My hands shook as I bolted the deadbolt. I could hear him breathing outside, slow and heavy. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, knife ready, listening as he circled the cabin, scraping at the walls, banging on windows, and calling out softly. No words, just noises that chilled me to the bone. Morning came again, bringing light and safety. When I finally got up the courage to look outside, the man was gone. No footprints, no sign he'd been there. Just the broken branches and the feeling that something dangerous had passed through. I packed my bag quickly and started the long hike back to civilization. The woods were brighter in the daylight, less threatening, but I kept my senses sharp, always watching for movement. When I finally reached the main road, I felt relief wash over me. I knew I'd never come back to that cabin or that forest. Some things I realized you just don't want to face alone. The memory of those nights stayed with me long after. The silence that wasn't silence, the footsteps that followed, the cold eyes in the dark. I never found out who that man was or why he was there, but I knew one thing for sure. Some places hold a danger you can't explain, and sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts, but the people who hide in the shadows. The first time I noticed something wasn't right was the moment I pulled up to the cabin. It was late afternoon, early fall, and the woods around the place were already losing their summer green, turning into this patchwork of dull yellows and browns. The air had that sharp, cold bite that hinted winter was coming soon. I'd rented the cabin for a week, planning some time away from the city. Just me, the woods, and a chance to clear my head. The road to the cabin was a long dirt track, twisting through thick trees and over small creeks. The kind of road where you can drive for 10 minutes and see no other cars. No signs of people, just the crackle of dead leaves under your tires and the constant drone of cicadas fading into occasional bird calls. As I turned the last corner and saw the cabin come into view, I remember thinking how perfect it looked. An old wooden structure with a wide porch and a chimney that still smoked faintly from the previous occupant's fire. The first thing that struck me was the silence. Not the kind of peaceful quiet you expect in nature. This was heavy silence, like the woods were holding their breath. No wind in the trees, no rustling of animals or birds, just stillness. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe it was just the time of day, or the way the forest leaned in tight around the clearing. I parked, grabbed my bags, and went inside. The cabin smelled like old pine and wood smoke. Everything was simple but cozy: faded curtains, a few mismatched chairs, a small wood stove, and a heavy wooden table covered with scratch marks. I unpacked, stacked some firewood near the stove, and set up my sleeping bag in the corner. That night, after eating a simple dinner, I built a fire in the stove. The flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, making the cabin feel warm and alive. Outside, the darkness was thick. The window near my bed framed the trees like black, moving shapes. I kept the door locked and triple-checked the windows before settling down to sleep. First, nothing happened. The usual creaks and groans of a wooden cabin settling. Maybe a twig snapped far away. But sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. Something low, almost like a growl, carried on the wind. It was faint but steady. My heart started to pound, and I sat up, listening. The fire in the stove had burned down to glowing coals, but the warmth kept me from shivering. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A heavy, slow breathing. It wasn't human, that was clear. It was deep and guttural. I wanted to tell myself it was just a wild animal, maybe a coyote or a wolf, but the sound had a strange rhythm, almost like deliberate breathing, measured and steady. I lay back down, telling myself to stay calm, but sleep didn't come easy after that. Every so often, the breathing would shift, sometimes speeding up, sometimes almost stopping, then returning. I kept my flashlight close and my phone charged, just in case. The next day, I tried to brush off the night's noises. I spent the daylight hours hiking nearby trails, admiring the way the sunlight filtered through the thinning leaves. Birds flitted from branch to branch, and I even spotted a deer drinking at a small stream. But as the day wore on, I noticed something else. Paw prints. They were huge, much bigger than any dog or wolf I'd seen tracks for. The prints stretched from the edge of the clearing right up to the cabin, some almost pressed up against the porch steps. Curious, I followed them a bit, but they vanished at the edge of the forest, swallowed by leaf litter and broken branches. I thought maybe the person who rented before me had a big dog, but then I saw the claw marks, not like dog scratches. These were long, deep gouges, almost like someone had sharpened their claws and dug them into the wood of the cabin's porch railings. The marks were fresh. That didn't sit right with me. That night, I stayed up later by the stove fire. The breathing sound came back, louder now, more confident. It circled the cabin in the dark. I swear I could hear heavy footsteps moving slowly just beyond the tree line, careful not to snap branches, but close enough to be heard if you listened hard. I didn't sleep well. When I finally drifted off, I was woken again by a terrible sound, half growl, half howl, coming from all directions at once. I turned on the porch light, shining it into the woods, but nothing moved, just the blackness. The only thing visible was a pair of yellow eyes, glowing just beyond the tree trunks. They stayed for a long moment, watching, unblinking, then disappeared. The next morning, I found more signs. Bits of fur caught in the fence wire, smears of dark blood on the bark of a nearby tree. Something had been hunting close by. I packed a small knife, just in case, and told myself to be careful, to avoid wandering far after dark. On the third day, things got worse. While gathering firewood, I heard the breathing again, but this time it was close, too close. I froze, slowly turning toward the sound. There, just beyond a stand of thin birch trees, stood a figure. At first, I thought it was a man in a dark coat, standing still, watching me. But then I saw the shape wasn't quite right. It was tall, unnaturally tall, with long arms and a broad chest covered in thick, dark fur. The head was shaped like a dog's, but bigger and more angular. The eyes glowed faintly in the shadows, sharp and intelligent. They didn't move, just stared. My mind screamed at me to run, but my feet were stuck. I stood there for what felt like forever before the figure slowly turned and vanished into the forest. The silence that followed was broken only by my ragged breathing. After that, I didn't go outside alone during the day, and at night I barely left the cabin. The sounds around me grew more intense. Heavy footsteps pacing outside the door, the occasional scrape of claws on wood, low growls that seemed to shake the very walls. I covered the windows with blankets, sealed the cracks in the doors with towels, anything to keep it out. On the 5th day, the dogman was bolder. It started leaving things on the porch. Bones gnawed clean, torn bits of clothing from the previous renters, scraps of trash from the cabin's garbage. I couldn't explain how it found these things, but it was clear it had been watching me closely, learning my habits. I made a plan to leave. I packed everything into my car just before dusk, but the moment I turned the key, the engine died. I tried again and again, nothing. Panic set in. I checked my phone, no signal. I was trapped. Outside, the breathing returned, louder than ever. The air grew thick with the smell of something wild and rotten. Wet fur, decaying leaves, and something more metallic, like blood. I locked myself in the cabin, piled furniture against the door, and grabbed the heaviest axe I could find. The dogman started howling then, a long, mournful sound that echoed through the night and into my bones. Hours passed. The howling faded, replaced by silence. I stayed awake, clutching the axe, waiting for morning. When dawn finally broke, the woods looked different, calm and ordinary again. I carefully unlocked the door and stepped outside. The paw prints were gone, the bones and scraps disappeared. The only evidence left was a single deep claw mark carved into the cabin door, right where my hand had been moments before. I got the engine to start after a few tries and left without looking back. I never went back to that cabin. The dogman might be out there, somewhere in those woods, watching and waiting. It wasn't a ghost or a story to scare kids. It was real, and it was something wild, something dangerous. The woods are full of secrets, and some of them don't want to be found. I drove down the narrow, twisting dirt road as the sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows over the forest. The car's headlights barely pierced the thick stand of pine and oak on either side. The road was rough, full of potholes and loose gravel, but I didn't mind. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A quiet weekend alone in the cabin my uncle had left me deep in the woods. No internet, no phone signal, just the sound of the wind and the trees. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, maybe a mile from the nearest paved road. I'd never been here before, but the old place looked just like I imagined, small, made of rough-hewn logs, with a stone chimney and a rusty tin roof. A thin wisp of smoke curled from the chimney, evidence the place was still somewhat maintained, though the paint on the window frames was peeling and some of the porch boards creaked underfoot. I pulled my bag from the back seat and locked the car. The air smelled like pine needles, damp earth, and smoke from the fireplace. The sky was fading from orange to dark blue, stars beginning to prick the sky. I closed the cabin door behind me and set my bag down. The wood floor groaned slightly under my boots. Inside, the place was simple. A small kitchen with a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a couch covered in threadbare fabric. The bedroom was just a single room with a bed, a small dresser, and a window looking out into the forest. I lit a fire in the stove, the flames crackling and throwing warm light around the room. Outside, the wind picked up, making the trees sway and whistle softly. I sat down, letting my shoulders relax for the first time in days. The first night was quiet, peaceful almost. The forest sounds were soothing, the occasional hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of some night bird. I slept soundly, the fire keeping the cabin warm. The next morning, I woke to the smell of damp earth and the sound of birds chirping. The sky was gray, heavy with low clouds. I went outside and took a deep breath, the air sharp and cool. I decided to explore the area, walking through the trees along a faint trail I spotted. The forest was thick, the ground soft with moss and fallen leaves. I noticed old tree stumps, moss-covered rocks, and the occasional broken branch that looked like it had been chewed on by some animal. As I wandered deeper, I found a small creek cutting through the woods, its water dark and cold. I knelt and cupped my hands to drink, the water tasting fresh and clean. It felt good to be so far from everything, disconnected from the noise of city life. That afternoon, the weather turned. Thick clouds rolled in, and by evening the wind was howling through the trees. I stoked the fire higher and checked my supplies. The cabin's old radio crackled weakly. No signal, but some static and faint interference. My phone had no bars. The wind rattled the windows and made the porch boards creak louder. I felt a strange kind of isolation settle over me, a quiet heaviness. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the wind and the deep silence. Still, as the night stretched on, I found myself listening harder to every sound outside. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a coyote. Sleep was fitful. Every time I closed my eyes, the wind seemed to grow louder, and I'd wake to the sound of something scratching at the side of the cabin. At first, I thought it was just a branch brushing the wall, but then I heard it again, a soft, deliberate scrape, like nails on wood. I got up, heart pounding, and grabbed the flashlight from the table. The beam cut through the dark outside, illuminating the porch and the surrounding trees. Nothing moved. The forest was still except for the wind. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or some small animal, but the sound didn't come again. Still, sleep escaped me, and I stayed awake, watching the shadows flicker. The next day was gray and wet, rain falling steadily. I stayed inside, trying to keep warm by the fire. The radio gave off strange, intermittent bursts of static, but no real voices or music. I started to feel the cabin's isolation pressing down on me. That evening, the wind returned with a fury. I heard the scratching again, louder this time. My stomach tightened as I realized the sound was coming from the back of the cabin, near the kitchen window. I forced myself to go check, flashlight in hand, stepping carefully through the damp porch. The rain made the boards slick underfoot, and the trees bent in the storm. When I reached the window, I shone the light around the side of the building. There, in the mud, I spotted deep scratches gouged into the wood of the cabin. The marks were fresh, the bark torn from the nearby bushes. My breath caught. Whatever had done this was big. A bear? But bears usually avoid humans. That night, I secured every door and window as best I could. I piled furniture against the kitchen door and locked the front one tight. Still, I lay awake listening to the wind tearing through the forest, imagining large shapes moving just beyond the tree line. Around midnight, I heard it again. A loud thud against the cabin wall, followed by scraping and growling low and deep. My heart hammered, and I stayed frozen, listening as the noises circled the building, moving from one side to the other. Then silence. When dawn finally came, pale and gray, I crept outside with the flashlight. The ground was churned up, huge footprints pressed into the mud. The claw marks on the walls were deeper and more numerous. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin, trying to stay busy. I knew I couldn't stay forever, but the nearest road was miles away, and the rain made the trails slippery and dangerous. The following night, the noises started again. This time, I heard snarls and heavy breathing right outside the window. I pressed my back to the wall, eyes wide in the dim light. Something was watching me. The feeling of being hunted settled deep in my chest. I knew then I had to leave before the animal got desperate or aggressive. The next morning, I packed quickly, moving through the cabin with shaky hands. I left the fire smoldering and carried my bag to the car, locking the doors behind me. The drive back was tense, my eyes flicking to the trees at every turn. The forest seemed darker, heavier somehow. When I finally reached the paved road, relief flooded me. I stopped at the nearest gas station, filled up, and called my uncle to tell him I wasn't coming back for a while. That weekend in the cabin taught me something I hadn't known before. The wilderness was beautiful but wild and unpredictable. It wasn't a place for comfort or peace, but a place that demanded respect, caution, and sometimes the courage to leave. The night I spent alone in that cabin still feels sharp in my mind, like a wound that never quite healed. It wasn't supposed to be anything special, just a weekend away from the noise of the city, a chance to clear my head. But the way things unfolded, I could never have expected how much it would change how I think about being alone out there in the woods. The cabin itself was nothing fancy. It was a small wooden structure tucked away deep in the forest, built maybe 50 years ago. The kind of place that looked like it hadn't been touched in a long time except for the occasional visitor. I found it listed on a rental site, advertised as remote, quiet, perfect for some solitude. Exactly what I wanted. It sat near a lake, surrounded by tall pine and oak trees, with a dirt road leading in and out. The only sounds promised were the wind, birds, and maybe some wildlife. I arrived just before sunset on a Friday. The sky was a deep orange-red, the kind of sunset that makes you stop and watch even if you're in a rush. The air was cool but not cold, filled with the scent of pine needles and earth. As I pulled up, the gravel crunched under my tires. The cabin sat at the edge of a clearing. Its dark brown would faded by years of sun and rain. I could see a small porch with a couple of rickety chairs, a stone fire pit nearby, and a rowboat pulled up by the lake's edge. I locked my car and carried my bags inside. The cabin smelled like old wood and a faint trace of smoke. It had one main room with a small kitchen area, a table and a wood stove. A narrow hallway led to a tiny bedroom with a creaky bed and a bathroom that barely fit a shower. There was no phone signal and no internet. No distractions. Just me and the forest. I unpacked slowly, setting out the things I'd brought. A book, a notebook, some food, and a flashlight with extra batteries. The cabin had a stack of firewood by the door, and I decided to get a fire going before it got dark. Outside, the wind started to pick up, making the pine needles shiver and sending a cold gust down the chimney. The first hours were peaceful. I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance against the dark windows. Outside, the lake shimmered faintly under the last light. I made myself some tea and wrote a little in my notebook, trying to clear my thoughts. The only sounds were the crackling wood and the occasional hoot of an owl. As darkness fell fully, the forest seemed to come alive in a way I hadn't felt before. Every small noise was sharper, louder. The rustle of leaves, twigs snapping under small animals, distant bird calls. I told myself it was normal, that the woods are full of life and that everything I heard was just part of the night. But as the hours passed, something about it unsettled me. I noticed a pattern to the noises, a rhythm that didn't fit with random animal sounds. There was a scraping sound, soft and deliberate, moving slowly around the perimeter of the clearing. At first, I thought it was the wind pushing branches against the cabin, but it felt too precise, like something was walking just beyond the tree line, circling the clearing, making sure it was noticed. I stood up and peered out the window. The forest was a black wall, with only the faintest outline of trees under the moonlight. I shone my flashlight outside, sweeping the beam slowly over the dark shapes. Nothing moved. Still, the scraping continued, slow and measured, moving from one side of the clearing to the other, then back again. The fire was almost out, so I added more wood, watching the sparks rise into the air. The cabin creaked around me as the wood settled, but the scraping didn't stop. Instead, it seemed to grow closer, as if whatever was making it was stepping just past the edge of the trees and back into the shadows. I forced myself to sit down again and told myself I was imagining things. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me jump. When the wind blew hard, I thought something was trying to push its way inside. At one point, I heard heavy breathing outside, slow and steady, like someone or something was waiting just past the clearing's edge. I grabbed my flashlight and a kitchen knife, moving cautiously toward the door. But when I opened it, there was nothing but cold air and the sound of leaves rattling in the breeze. By early morning, I was exhausted and on edge. I made coffee and sat by the window, trying to watch for any sign of what had been out there. The forest was quiet now, with just birds starting to call. I told myself it must have been an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, curious about the cabin. That seemed like the only logical explanation. But as the sun rose higher, I noticed something that chilled me. Deep scratches on the outside wood of the cabin's wall, near the door. They were long, jagged, and fresh. Not claw marks like from a bear, but more like something sharp had been scraping against the wood. The marks were at about my height, maybe a little taller. I checked the windows, too. There were small chips and dents in the glass, like someone had hit it with a rock or a branch. Whoever or whatever had been out there had been close. Too close. I didn't want to stay another night, but I had no cell signal to call for a ride, and the nearest road was a good 20-minute walk away. I gathered my things quickly and planned to leave as soon as there was enough light. Before I left, I went outside to take one last look around. The morning air was crisp and smelled fresh. The lake was calm, reflecting the bright sky, but the forest still felt heavy, like it was watching. I walked around the cabin, looking for any other signs. That's when I saw the footprints, large, uneven, and deep in the soft earth. They circled the clearing twice before fading into the woods. They weren't human, not exactly. The shape was odd, wider and longer than a man's boot. They had claw marks, but not like a bear's paws. More like something in between. I took pictures with my phone, then hurried back to the car. The dirt road was rough but dry, and I drove as fast as I dared, glancing in my rearview mirror at the trees slipping past. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me, even as the forest disappeared behind me. When I finally reached a place with signal, I called the rental company and told them what happened. They acted surprised, saying no one had reported anything before. They promised to send someone to check the cabin and said I could have a refund. I don't know what was out there that night. Maybe it was an animal I'd never seen before, or someone living off the grid. Maybe it was something else entirely. But I never went back to that cabin, and I don't plan to. I learned that the woods can be quiet, peaceful, even beautiful, but they can also hide things you don't expect. Things that don't belong in stories or legends but are real enough to scare you to your core. That weekend taught me that sometimes being alone in the wilderness isn't about ghosts or monsters. It's about the unknown and how small and vulnerable you really are out there. I don't have a tidy ending to this story, no neat conclusion that makes everything okay. What I do know is this: I was lucky. I left when I could, and nothing followed me out. But every time I think about that night, the silence and the scraping and those strange footprints, I realize I might never really be alone in the woods again. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a quiet escape from the constant noise of the city, a break from work, and the perfect chance to get away from everything. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor, with nothing but the forest stretching out all around it. Just me and a couple of old friends, all eager to reconnect and relax for a few days. The drive up had been long but scenic. We passed rolling hills and quiet, winding roads that seemed to get narrower with every turn, until we finally reached the cabin. It was a small, rustic place, with peeling wood on the outside and a steep, pitched roof that looked like something out of an old postcard. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, but not in the kind of way that makes you run in fear. It was charming in a way, like a forgotten piece of the past. We were ready for the weekend. After unloading our gear, we all took a moment to appreciate the quiet. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves and the occasional bird call in the distance. It was perfect, almost too perfect, but we were all so eager to be away from the chaos of everyday life that we didn't think much about it. The first night passed without incident. We ate a simple meal of grilled food over an open fire, shared some drinks, and swapped old stories from our high school days. The usual fun stuff. We even went for a short hike before dark, just to stretch our legs after the long drive. The sun set early, and by the time we got back to the cabin, the forest had already swallowed the light, leaving only the glow of the fire to keep us company. The second night was different, though. That's when things started to feel off. It started with the quiet. The fire crackled, and the wind blew through the trees, but something about the stillness felt unnatural. I had a strange sense of being watched, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing but the blackness of the woods. I brushed it off. My friends were still chatting around the fire, oblivious to anything strange. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. At one point, I went inside the cabin to grab another drink. The place was small and cozy, with wooden floors and a large stone fireplace. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I stood in the doorway, looking out the window toward the forest, I thought I saw something move in the distance. It was quick, just a flash of shadow, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I peered harder into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Maybe it was a deer, or maybe I was just tired. I didn't mention it to anyone when I went back outside. The night grew colder, and the air felt thicker. The fire burned low, and the chatter around the campfire began to fade. Everyone seemed to be winding down, ready for bed. But just as I was about to go inside, I heard something. It was a soft, rustling sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. This wasn't the soft shuffle of a small animal. It was something heavier, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I turned to my friend, Nick, who had been sitting closest to me. I could see the same concern in his eyes, a look that mirrored what I was feeling. We both listened, trying to figure out what it was. The rustling stopped, but the sense of something being there, watching us, remained. We stood up, both of us unsure of what to do. Probably just a deer, Nick muttered, but his voice didn't have the same confidence as usual. It's probably nothing. I nodded, though I wasn't so sure. I didn't believe in supernatural stuff, no ghosts or spirits. But that didn't mean I wasn't afraid. Fear isn't always logical. Sometimes you just feel it in your gut. We all eventually headed inside. The cabin was warm, and we quickly made ourselves comfortable, pulling out sleeping bags and settling down for the night. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the nagging sense that something was out there. I heard things outside, but I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or something else. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to a strange sound in the middle of the night. It wasn't the wind or the usual night noises. It was a scratching sound, slow and methodical, like something was trying to dig into the cabin itself. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was coming from outside or inside the cabin. The sound continued, getting louder, and I could feel my heart racing. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. This was different. I got up quietly, careful not to wake the others. The moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. I moved to the door and peeked out into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the noise. First, I saw nothing, just the usual trees and the slight sway of the branches in the wind. But then, my eyes locked onto something that made my blood run cold. There, standing just outside the edge of the firelight, was a figure. It wasn't a man, but it wasn't an animal either. It was tall, unnaturally so, and it seemed to sway in the shadows as if it was made of them. Its limbs were long, too long, and bent at odd angles, like a spider's legs. Its skin, or whatever covered its body, was pale and stretched tight over its bones, with patches of dark, mottled coloring. It had no clothes, no face, just a smooth, featureless head that seemed to reflect the moonlight in a sickly way. It was like looking at a thing from a nightmare, too grotesque to be real. Yet there it was. Couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The creature's head slowly turned toward the cabin. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, black pits of emptiness that seemed to suck in the light around them. It didn't blink, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at me. And then it began to move, slowly at first, dragging its long limbs over the forest floor. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, sliding across the earth in an unnatural way, like it wasn't bound by the laws of gravity or nature. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest, and I realized I had to do something. It wasn't a deer or a raccoon or anything normal. This thing was not right. I moved to wake up Nick, but before I could, there was a loud crash from outside. The creature had slammed its arm into a tree, knocking it over with an impossible amount of force. It made a horrible, scraping noise as it slid across the ground, heading straight for the cabin. I had no choice. I had to warn everyone. "Nick!" I hissed, shaking him awake. "Get up now." He groggily sat up, blinking in confusion. "What's going on?" "Get to the back door. Now," I whispered urgently. We didn't have time to argue. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. We were miles from any cell towers. The others woke up at the noise, their faces pale with fear. We all scrambled, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the creature outside was getting closer. I could hear its movements, scraping against the earth like claws dragging over stone. Then there was a sound from the roof, a low, almost guttural noise, like something scraping against the shingles. I couldn't help but glance up at the ceiling, wondering if whatever it was had somehow made its way up there. The scratching noise continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. It was closing in on us, circling the cabin, testing our defenses. We bolted for the back door, not bothering to look out the windows anymore. We ran through the dark woods, the trees whipping by, branches snapping under our feet. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding in my chest, and looked back toward the cabin. The creature was gone. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. The others were shaken, terrified, but no one spoke about what we had seen. What could we say? No one would believe us. The next day, we went back to the cabin. Everything seemed normal, too normal. There was no sign of what had happened, no tracks, no broken trees, no evidence of the creature. It was like nothing had happened at all. But I knew what I had seen. It was real. We left shortly after that, and I never went back. I don't know what that creature was, but I know it wasn't something I'd ever want to see again. I'm still not sure what it was doing in those woods, or why it was so interested in us, but I've never forgotten that night. It's been years now, but every time I think about it, I get the same feeling I had back then. Like something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I hope I never have to face it again. I'd been looking forward to this weekend for months. After a long stretch of work and the constant noise of the city, the idea of escaping to a small cabin in the woods sounded like exactly what I needed. I'd rented the place myself, a tiny, isolated cabin about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town, tucked deep in the mountains. The listing said it was rustic and peaceful, perfect for a quiet break. No phone signal, no internet, just me and the forest. The drive out was uneventful, mostly winding roads flanked by towering pine trees. I stopped a few times to take pictures, breathe in the clean mountain air, and stretch my legs. I noticed that the farther I went, the fewer cars I passed. Eventually, I didn't see another vehicle for nearly an hour. The last stretch was a rough dirt road that rattled my car and made me drive slowly. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it looked just like the pictures. Small and square, with weathered wooden walls, a steep roof, and a porch that wrapped around one side. Smoke curled faintly from the stone chimney, though the place looked empty. The whole area was quiet except for the occasional bird or the rustle of leaves in the wind. I grabbed my bags and headed inside. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and something earthy, like damp moss. It was sparsely furnished but cozy. A small kitchen with basic appliances, a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a tiny couch. There was a loft with a bed, which I planned to sleep on. The windows looked out over a clearing, surrounded by thick forest in every direction. I set down my bags and went to explore outside a bit, just to get my bearings. The clearing was maybe 50 yards wide, the grass a little overgrown but not wild. Beyond it, the trees pressed in, tall and dense. There was no trail, just a faint animal path winding off into the woods. I could see broken branches and some fallen logs, and the ground was soft and damp from recent rain. I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking and cleaning up. I had brought food for a few days, some canned beans, rice, vegetables, and coffee. There was firewood stacked neatly next to the porch, so I decided to start a fire in the stove early to warm the place up. The wood was dry, and the fire caught quickly, sending a comforting glow and warmth through the room. Outside, the sun was starting to sink behind the mountains. The forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sky fade from orange to deep purple. The air was cooler now, and a slight breeze stirred the pine needles. I had no plans for the evening except to read and rest. I knew I wouldn't get any phone signal here, so I'd left my phone mostly off to save battery. Part of me liked that. Being cut off felt freeing. As night fell, I went inside, closed the windows, and stoked the fire. The cabin felt warm and safe. I settled into the couch with a book and a blanket. Outside, the sounds of the forest were alive. The hoot of an owl, the occasional snap of a twig, the rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. Around 10, I put out the fire and climbed up the narrow ladder to the loft. The bed was firm but comfortable, with thick blankets. I lay there for a while, listening to the sounds outside. The woods were alive with noise, but nothing seemed close enough to worry me. I eventually fell asleep. I woke suddenly sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The cabin was dark and quiet, except for the low creaks of the old wood settling and the distant call of a coyote or two. Then I heard it. A faint noise from outside, near the edge of the clearing. Sounded like footsteps, soft and slow. I froze. I hadn't heard any cars or people arrive, and the cabin was supposed to be isolated. My heart started to beat faster. I stayed still, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, then started again, moving slowly along the tree line. I was sure I had locked the door and closed all the windows, but the thought of someone or something outside my cabin in the middle of nowhere made my skin crawl. I quietly slipped out of bed and crept to the window. Peering out, I could just make out the dark shapes of the trees against the night sky. The moon was low, providing just enough light to see movement. I saw a figure moving between the trees, just beyond the clearing. It was hard to tell exactly what it was. Maybe a person in dark clothes? They moved carefully, like they didn't want to be seen. I couldn't hear any voices, just the soft sound of footsteps on leaves. I went back to bed but couldn't sleep. My mind was racing. Who could be out there? Was it a hunter? Someone lost? Or someone with bad intentions? At first light, I decided I needed to get out and check the area around the cabin. I dressed quickly, put on my boots, and grabbed a small backpack with water and a flashlight. The air was cold and fresh, the woods alive with morning sounds. Outside, I walked slowly around the clearing, looking for signs of whoever had been out there. The grass was wet with dew, and I noticed footprints, heavy, booted footprints, leading from the tree line around the cabin's edge, then disappearing back into the forest. They weren't fresh. The footprints looked like they'd been there for hours, maybe from the previous night. I followed the trail a little into the woods, but it quickly became too dense and the prints faded. I returned to the cabin feeling uneasy but trying to shake it off. Maybe it was just a hiker passing by or a hunter tracking game. That day, I stayed mostly inside, keeping the doors locked and windows closed. I tried to focus on reading, but every little noise made me jump. The quiet no longer felt peaceful, it felt tense. That afternoon, I decided to build a bigger fire outside on the porch. I gathered some kindling and larger logs from the pile and made a good blaze. The crackling fire gave me some comfort, and the warm light pushed back the shadows around the cabin. As the sun went down again, I sat by the fire for a while, watching the woods beyond the clearing grow dark. I tried to listen for anything unusual, but nothing came except the normal forest sounds. I went inside earlier than the night before, stoked the stove fire, and got ready for bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Around midnight, I was awakened by a sudden, sharp noise, something heavy hitting the side of the cabin. A loud thud, followed by the sound of scraping against wood. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. The cabin shook slightly from the impact. I grabbed the flashlight and crept out of the loft, trying to keep quiet. The fire in the stove was nearly out, but the room was illuminated enough by the flashlight to see the walls and door. I went to the door and looked out the window next to it. Outside, in the moonlight, I saw fresh scratches on the cabin's wooden siding, long, deep gouges, as if made by claws or something sharp. I scanned the area around the porch with the flashlight beam but didn't see any movement. My mind raced. What could have caused that? A bear? I had read that bears sometimes investigate cabins, especially if they smelled food. I was alone here with no easy way to get help. My phone had no signal, and the nearest neighbors were miles away. I decided to double-check all the windows and doors, making sure everything was locked tight. I moved carefully, flashlight in hand, and went around the cabin's perimeter inside, checking every window. All were closed and latched. The door lock seemed fine. Still, the thought of a large animal or even a person outside made me nervous. I decided to keep the stove fire burning longer this time, hoping the warmth and light would discourage any unwanted visitors. I sat in the main room for a while, listening. Then I heard it again, a low, guttural growl, followed by heavy footsteps moving away from the cabin into the woods. I stayed still and quiet, holding my breath. The sounds faded, replaced by the normal night noises. Eventually, I forced myself to climb back up to the loft, the flashlight still on, and kept it close as I tried to sleep. I must have dozed off because I woke to the first light of dawn. That morning, I forced myself to get up and check outside. The scratches on the cabin were worse than I thought. Deep claw marks ran several feet across the wall near the porch. There were bits of bark torn off nearby, and disturbed earth where something heavy had dug or scratched. I found large animal tracks around the cabin. Definitely not a person's. They looked like bear prints, big pads, long claws. I felt a cold knot in my stomach. I had never been this close to a bear before. I knew bears could be dangerous, especially if they felt threatened or smelled food. I carefully searched the area for any food I might have left outside or any trash that could attract them. I packed up all my food into heavy plastic bags and stored them inside the cabin. I made sure to clean the cabin thoroughly to remove any food smells. That day, I stayed mostly inside, too nervous to explore. I tried to keep busy, reading and writing in my journal, but I kept hearing noises in the forest, branches breaking, leaves rustling, heavy footsteps. Each time I looked outside, I half expected to see the bear. That night, I built the biggest fire I could outside on the porch, sitting as close to it as possible to keep warm and safe. The air was colder than I expected that night as I pulled up the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin. It was early October, and the trees were just starting to show their fall colors, the reds and yellows bright against the dark green pines. I had been looking forward to this solo trip for weeks. A few days away from the noise of the city, no phones, no internet, just the quiet woods and the little cabin my uncle had built years ago on the edge of a sprawling forest in northern Vermont. The place was rustic but sturdy. Wooden walls, a stone chimney, and a small porch with 2 rocking chairs facing a small clearing. I had been here a couple of times before with family, but this was the first time I'd come alone. The headlights cut through the thickening dusk as I parked near the cabin. The gravel crunched under the tires, and the smell of damp earth and pine needles filled the air. The sky was a dark gray curtain, heavy with the promise of rain, and the wind pushed through the trees, rattling the branches and carrying a cold breath that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I grabbed my backpack and flashlight, locking the car behind me before stepping onto the porch. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and a faint hint of mothballs from the blankets stuffed in the cedar chest. The walls were lined with shelves holding old books, some maps, and a few dusty tins of canned food. A cast iron stove stood cold in the corner, its black surface dull and covered in a light film of dust. I pulled the thick curtains aside to let what little light there was into the room and lit the lantern hanging near the door. The warm yellow glow filled the cabin, casting shadows that danced lightly on the walls. I set my backpack down by the rough wooden table and unpacked my things. A few cans of beans, a loaf of bread, a thermos of coffee, and a book on local wildlife. The radio on the shelf was old but still functional, though I didn't expect to get much signal this far out. The only connection to the outside world was the thin thread of a road, and even that was far away. After a quick meal and another round of coffee, I decided to get the fire going. The pile of wood was stacked neatly outside under a tarp, though it had started to get damp from the moisture in the air. I grabbed a few sticks and some paper from the kitchen and set to work in the stone hearth. After a few frustrating attempts, The kindling caught and the fire slowly blossomed, crackling and popping as the flames grew. I sat near the stove, warming my hands and listening to the sounds outside. The wind sighing through the branches, the distant hoot of an owl, and the occasional snap of a twig. The sky outside was nearly black now, but the stars struggled through the thin clouds, faint points of cold light. I had planned to spend the evening reading and just relaxing, but as the night grew deeper, a creeping sense of unease began to settle in. It was subtle at first, like the way a room feels colder after a door closes somewhere far away. The wind outside shifted, growing stronger and more urgent, howling through the trees and making the cabin's walls groan faintly. I checked the windows, thick panes with wooden shutters, but the darkness pressed against the glass, swallowing the small circle of light the lantern made. After a while, I thought I heard something else. A soft scrape near the back of the cabin, like something dragging or sliding across the fallen leaves. I froze, listening hard. The wind masked the sound, but it was definitely there. A dull scratching that came and went, irregular and slow. My heart picked up, but I told myself it was probably just a branch or a small animal moving through the underbrush. The forest was full of raccoons and deer this time of year. Maybe a coyote. I tried to focus on the book in my hands, but the feeling didn't go away. Something wasn't right. The cabin was old, and it made noises, wood creaking as it settled, the stove shifting as it cooled, but the sounds outside were different, more deliberate. I put the book down and stood, walking slowly to the back door. The moon had just risen, a thin sliver of silver light slicing through the clouds. I stepped out onto the porch and swept the beam of my flashlight over the clearing. The woods pressed close around the cabin, thick and shadowed. The trees seemed to lean in, their trunks dark and silent. I scanned the edges carefully. Nothing, just leaves fluttering in the wind and shadows moving with the breeze. Then I saw it, a shape, low to the ground, slipping between two trees about 30 yards away. It was too dark to see clearly, but the way it moved was deliberate and silent. I blinked and the shape was gone. My breath caught in my throat. I had been sure I was alone out here. I went back inside quickly, bolting the door and sliding the bolt home. I grabbed my phone, even though I knew the signal was weak, no bars. The radio crackled faintly, but no voices came through, only static and the occasional whine of interference. I sat back down near the fire, trying to calm myself. Could have been a deer or a stray dog. I reminded myself I had left the city to be in the wilderness, and the wilderness had its own rules and sounds. But then the noise started again. This time it was louder, a slow, scraping sound coming from the side of the cabin. I turned my head sharply toward the window, heart pounding. The light from the fire threw flickering shadows across the yard. The sound was more distinct now, like nails scraping against wood, or perhaps claws digging into the dirt. I swallowed hard and stood, picking up the heavy cast iron poker from beside the stove. The firelight caught the metal, making it gleam. I walked to the window and peered out. Nothing visible, no movement, but the scratching continued. My pulse raced. I was alone, miles from the nearest neighbor, and completely exposed. I tried to tell myself to stay calm, to think logically. Maybe it was an animal curious about the cabin. Maybe it was just the wind again, twisting leaves and branches into eerie sounds. I decided to check outside just to be sure. I grabbed my flashlight and a small hunting knife I had packed, and eased the door open. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and biting. The wind had picked up again, whipping through the trees with a low roar. The clouds had thickened, blotting out the moon. I stepped off the porch, the beam of my flashlight sweeping the ground. The earth was damp and cold underfoot, fallen leaves soaking in the moisture. The woods loomed just beyond the clearing, black and silent. I circled the cabin slowly, shining the light toward the side where the scratching had come from. The bushes here were thick, branches tangled and wet with dew. The light caught on something near the base of a tree. It was a set of deep claw marks, gouged into the bark. Fresh. My stomach twisted. I shone the light downward and saw tracks. Large paw prints pressed into the soft earth, heading away from the cabin toward the deeper forest. A bear. I realized with a sudden jolt that the creature lurking outside wasn't some small animal. It was a bear, and it had been close enough to touch. I hurried back inside, slamming and locking the door behind me. My hands trembled as I set the poker down and fetched my phone again. Still no signal. I sat on the floor near the fire, trying to make sense of what to do. Bears were common in the area, but usually they kept their distance from humans. Something must have brought this one close to the cabin. Maybe hunger, or maybe it had been startled and was feeling threatened. I remembered the box of canned food in the pantry. I hadn't locked it up because I didn't expect any animals to get in. But what if the bear was attracted by the smell? The thought made me uneasy. Hours passed. The wind died down, and the forest grew quiet again. I forced myself to eat a little, warming some beans on the stove. The fire crackled and popped, filling the silence. Suddenly, a sharp noise cut through the stillness. A loud thud against the side of the cabin, followed by heavy scraping. The bear was back. I jumped to my feet, heart pounding in my chest. The sound repeated, something large pushing against the wall, claws scraping the wood. It was trying to get in. I grabbed the poker again and moved to the door, listening. The creature growled low, a guttural sound that shook the windows. The porch light flickered. Panic surged, but I forced myself to breathe. I remembered a small window near the stove, one that locked but was old and warped. If the bear got in, I was trapped. I needed to get out. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed it with essentials, the flashlight, water bottle, some food bars, and slid it on. The bear was still pounding on the walls, more desperate now. I edged toward the back window and tried the latch. Stuck at first, then gave with a creak. I slid the window open just enough to squeeze through. The cold night air rushed in, smelling like pine and damp earth. I climbed out carefully, landing on the soft moss below. The forest was darker here, the trees close and dense. I didn't look back. I started running, my breath coming in short bursts, heart hammering. Branches scraped my arms and face as I pushed through the undergrowth. The bear's roars echoed behind me, but the noise began to fade as I put distance between us. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs ached. Eventually, I found the dirt road and followed it toward the main highway. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me, the cabin, and the forest. The kind of place where the only sound is the wind in the trees or the crackle of a fire. I had been looking forward to getting away from the noise of the city, the endless chatter, and the constant pressure. I wanted peace. What I got was something far from it. I drove down the narrow dirt road, the tires crunching over the gravel. The forest closed in tightly on both sides, tall pine trees casting long shadows even though the sun was still high. I passed a couple of empty logging trucks parked by the roadside, their engines off, rust creeping over their metal frames. The smell of wet earth and pine filled the air. The cabin was supposed to be at the end of this road, a small, weathered wooden house tucked just beyond a bend. I pulled up, shutting the engine off and sitting for a moment to breathe it all in. The cabin looked old but solid. Its wood had faded to a dull gray, and the windows were dirty, clouded with dust and grime. There was a small porch with a sagging roof, a few wooden steps leading up. No one else was around. I grabbed my backpack and stepped out, my boots crunching on the gravel. Inside, the cabin was colder than I expected. The air smelled stale, like it hadn't been opened in a long time. Dust floated in the shafts of light through the grimy windows. The furniture was sparse. A small table, 2 chairs, a rusty stove in the corner, and a bed with a thin, faded blanket. I set my things down and opened a window to let some fresh air in. The quiet settled around me again. As I moved around, unpacking my things and setting up the small camp stove to boil water for tea, I noticed something odd on the floor near the door. It was a small shard of glass, jagged and sharp. I looked around, half expecting to see a broken window or something smashed, but nothing. The windows were intact, no cracks or holes. The glass was dirty, with dried blood smeared on the edges. I frowned and set it aside on the table. The afternoon passed slowly. I explored the small area around the cabin, the forest thick and green, the trees crowded close. The light was soft and golden, filtering through the leaves, but there was an unease creeping in, subtle and quiet. Something about the silence felt wrong, not peaceful but watchful. Back inside, I lit a fire in the stove to warm up the place. The flickering flames cast long shadows on the walls, and the cabin suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in. I was about to make a cup of tea when I heard a noise outside, a faint scrape, like something dragging across the dirt. I froze and listened. Nothing, just the wind. I told myself it was an animal, a branch rubbing against the cabin. The sun started to dip behind the trees, the forest growing darker, the shadows stretching. I closed the windows and locked the door, double-checking the rusty bolt. I sat by the small table, the shard of glass still there, catching the firelight. I felt a chill, but I blamed it on the cold. Night fell fast in the forest. The cabin was plunged into darkness except for the firelight. The woods outside were silent, almost too silent. No birds, no insects, just the sound of the wind in the branches. I tried to read, but my eyes kept darting to the window, half expecting to see something, anything, moving out there. Then I heard it. The scrape again, louder this time, coming from the side of the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and edged toward the window. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it would burst out of my chest. Outside, in the beam of light, the ground looked disturbed, like someone had been digging or dragging something heavy. I shined the light across the edge of the forest, but there was nothing. No figure, no movement. I backed away from the window, the beam shaking in my hand. That's when I saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, just beyond the tree-line. The light flickered and it vanished. I blinked, but it was gone. I told myself to calm down. It was probably just a trick of the light, my imagination running wild. But the feeling of being watched gnawed at me. I locked the door again and sat with my back against it. The fire was dying down, the cabin growing colder. I thought about leaving, but the dirt road was miles away, and it was already dark. No cell signal, no neighbors, just me and the forest. Suddenly, there was a knock, soft at first, then harder. Not the polite knock of someone asking to be let in, but something deliberate, heavy. My breath caught. I stayed frozen, listening. Another knock. I turned off the fire, plunging the cabin into near darkness. The flashlight, the only light. The knocking stopped. I waited, my heart pounding. Then came the sound of glass breaking, sharp, sudden. It was coming from the front window. I scrambled to the window and shone the flashlight out, the beam cutting through the night. There, on the porch, was the shard of glass. More than that, broken glass scattered across the floorboards. The window cracked and spiderwebbed. I stepped back and locked the door again, pulling the bolt tight. Then I saw him. He was standing just past the porch, barely visible in the shadows. Thin, disheveled, wearing dirty clothes that hung off his frame. His eyes glinted in the flashlight beam, cold and empty. In one hand, he held a shard of glass, sharp and jagged, the edges catching the light. I didn't move. I didn't speak. I just stared. His face was pale, almost gaunt, with dirt smudged across his cheeks and forehead. His mouth was set in a grim line. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, holding the glass. I backed away slowly toward the corner of the cabin, looking for anything to defend myself. The old wooden chair was close. I grabbed it, holding it like a weapon, my hands trembling. The man took a step forward, slow and deliberate. His eyes never left mine. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat. The room was too small, the windows broken, the door locked but probably not strong enough to keep him out for long. The man raised the shard of glass slowly, almost casually, like it was just another tool. The silence stretched, broken only by my ragged breathing. Then, as suddenly as he appeared, he turned and disappeared back into the trees. I heard the crunch of leaves and twigs as he vanished into the forest. I didn't move for what felt like hours, just sitting in the dark, clutching the chair. I waited for more sounds, more movement, but the night stayed still. When the first light of dawn filtered through the windows, I didn't wait. I grabbed my backpack, threw on my jacket, and bolted out the door. The cold morning air hit my face, sharp and fresh. I didn't look back as I ran down the dirt road, my boots pounding against the gravel. It was a long run to my car, every step filled with the memory of those empty eyes and the cold glass shard. When I finally reached the road, I didn't stop until the trees thinned and the asphalt appeared beneath my tires. I drove away, the cabin shrinking behind me until it was just a speck among the trees. I never went back. The shard of glass was left behind on the table, a silent reminder of the night I wasn't alone in that cabin. A reminder that sometimes, the things that scare us most aren't ghosts or monsters, but real people with real intentions, waiting in the dark. I found the strength to tell the authorities what happened. They came out to the cabin days later. The broken window, the footprints in the dirt, the discarded shards of glass. It all matched my story. They said the man might have been a drifter or someone hiding out in the woods, desperate and dangerous. They warned me to be careful, to always lock my doors, to never underestimate how dark the world could get. The experience stayed with me for years. Every time I'm alone in a quiet place, I think of that night. The cold eyes, the broken glass, the silence broken by a slow, deliberate knock. It taught me that safety is never guaranteed, that the quiet can hide the worst kinds of danger. But it also taught me something else, that fear can be faced, that running away doesn't make you weak. Sometimes it's the only way to survive, and that's what I did. I ran, and I lived. The forest around the cabin was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and thick like something is holding its breath. I'd been there for a few days, alone except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the wind. The cabin was small and old, built from rough logs that had darkened with age. It sat at the edge of a clearing surrounded by tall pines and oaks. A dirt path led back toward the road, but I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. I had planned this trip to get away from everything. Work, city noise, people. Just me, the woods, and the silence. The first 2 days were peaceful. I spent my time chopping wood, reading, and hiking through the trees. The air was crisp, clean, and smelled of pine and earth. At night, I'd sit on the porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars blink out one by one as the sky grew darker. The cabin's windows glowed softly from the firelight inside, but outside, the forest was deep and black. On the third night, something changed. It started with a noise, a low, guttural sound that didn't belong in the forest. At first, I thought it was a coyote, but the sound didn't match any howl I'd ever heard. It was closer, sharper, more animal than human, but still strange. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I listened from inside the cabin. The fire had died down, and the room felt cold even though the heater was on. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, stepping carefully on the porch. The beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping over the clearing and the tree line beyond. I thought maybe I'd catch a glimpse of a wild animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but there was nothing. The only sound was the crunch of dry leaves under my boots and the faint rustling of branches. The noise started again, closer this time, but I couldn't see anything. It wasn't a howl or a bark, more like a breath mixed with a growl. I scanned the edges of the clearing and the shadows beneath the trees, feeling a cold knot tighten in my stomach. I decided to go back inside, locking the door behind me and pulling the curtains shut. I sat by the fire, trying to calm down and convince myself it was nothing, probably just a wild animal passing through. But the noise stayed with me, echoing in the silence of the night. Came again and again, each time a little closer, a little more urgent. The next morning, I went out to inspect the perimeter of the cabin. The ground was soft from last night's light rain, and I looked carefully for tracks. Near the tree line, I found something odd. Prints that looked like a dog's, but not quite right. The toes were longer and thinner, and the paw pads were wider and more spread out. They seemed too big for any dog I knew. I followed the tracks a little, but they disappeared under a patch of brambles. I didn't tell anyone because I wasn't sure what I had seen, and honestly, I didn't want to scare myself. I kept busy during the day, chopping more wood and preparing meals. But as night came again, I felt the weight of something watching me. That evening, just after sunset, I was inside the cabin when I heard something moving outside. It was soft at first, small branches snapping, leaves rustling, but then louder. Something was coming closer to the cabin. I froze, listening. The sound was slow, deliberate. It wasn't a deer bounding through the underbrush. It was heavier, with a steady pace like something large was walking right toward me. My heart pounded as I grabbed the flashlight again, ready to face whatever was out there. I stepped onto the porch and shined the beam around. There, at the edge of the clearing, I saw it. First, it looked like a large dog. Its body was lean and muscular, but something about it was wrong. The fur was matted and patchy, a dull mix of gray and brown. Its eyes reflected the flashlight beam with an eerie yellow glow, but they didn't look like dog's eyes. They were too narrow, almost human in shape, and filled with something cold and calculating. It didn't move at first, just stared. Its mouth was slightly open, showing sharp, uneven teeth. The way it held its head, low and tense, was like it was sizing me up. I swallowed hard and took a step back, but it didn't follow. Instead, it turned and melted into the trees, disappearing before I could blink. I locked the door behind me and sat back down by the fire, trying to steady my breathing. I told myself it was just a wild animal, maybe a coyote or a wolf, but I had never seen anything like that creature before. It didn't look wild, it looked broken, something lost or sick. I wondered if it had been hurt or was starving. The nights after that were tense. I kept the fire burning bright, the windows closed tight. Every time I heard the noise outside, my pulse quickened. I never saw the creature again in the same way, but I caught glimpses of it. Shadows moving between trees, a flash of those strange eyes reflecting in the dark. On the fourth night, I decided to stay inside and wait it out. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows and shaking the cabin. The fire sputtered and flared, casting long shadows on the walls. Suddenly, I heard a scratching at the door. I froze. The sound was slow and methodical, like claws dragging against the wood. My heart felt like it was going to burst. The scratching stopped, then started again, moving lower, toward the bottom of the door. I shined the flashlight down and saw the creature's yellow eyes staring back at me, barely visible in the dark. I didn't open the door. I just sat there, breathing slowly, hoping it would go away. After a long moment, the scratching stopped, and the forest went silent again. The next morning, I found marks on the door, deep scratches that had torn through the wood. There were patches of fur stuck in the splinters, the same dull gray-brown color. I examined the scratches closely. They were long and jagged, made by something with sharp claws much bigger than any dog's. I knew then the creature had been closer than ever before, but it hadn't broken in. For some reason, it was watching, waiting, but not attacking. I wondered what it wanted. Over the next day, I stayed alert, never leaving the cabin for long. The tracks were around the clearing every morning, and at night the noises came, sometimes breathing, sometimes a low growl. But the creature never came back to the door or showed itself fully. On the sixth night, the weather turned bad. Rain poured down in heavy sheets, thunder rolled overhead, and lightning flashed, lighting up the dark woods in brief bursts. I sat near the window, watching the storm rage outside. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. The creature was standing in the middle of the clearing, soaked and shivering. Its fur hung in wet clumps, and it looked thinner, weaker. It raised its head and let out a long, low howl that sounded almost like a plea. The sound made something twist inside me. It wasn't threatening anymore. It sounded lost and scared. Without thinking, I grabbed an old blanket and some scraps of meat I had saved and went outside, stepping carefully through the mud. The creature didn't run. It just watched as I laid the food down a few feet from it. Then it crouched and began eating slowly. I kept my distance but stayed close enough to see it better. Its eyes softened a little, and it looked less wild, more like an animal in pain. I didn't know what it was or where it had come from, but it was real, and it was struggling to survive. The storm passed by morning, leaving the forest wet and sparkling. When I woke, the creature was gone. No tracks, no signs it had been there. It had disappeared like a shadow. The rest of my trip passed quietly. I packed up and left the cabin feeling changed. That strange dog-like creature had been something I couldn't explain. A wild thing caught between the forest and the edge of civilization, lost and lonely. I never saw it again, but I still think about it. About how close it came and how it trusted me enough to eat from my hand. That experience stayed with me. A reminder that the woods hold secrets that don't always make sense. Not every wild thing is dangerous. Sometimes they just want to be left alone, to survive another day in a world that's growing smaller and harder to live in. When I look back, I realize the creature wasn't just a threat or a mystery. It was a living, breathing part of the forest, as real and fragile as I am. And for a little while, we shared a silent understanding beneath the dark, endless trees. The sun had already begun its slow dip behind the thick line of trees by the time I pulled off the main road. The gravel crunching under my tires sounded too loud in the otherwise quiet forest. I'd been looking forward to this weekend for months. A small cabin my uncle owned deep in the woods, far away from the buzz of the city. A place where cell signal vanished and all that mattered was the crackle of the fire and the smell of pine. The road to the cabin was little more than a dirt track, uneven and narrow, winding past tall firs and thick underbrush. I drove slow, eyes scanning every shadow that flickered as the last rays of light fought to survive the coming night. When I finally saw the cabin, the sight gave me a small relief. It looked old, but sturdy, rough timber walls darkened with age and weather. The roof sagged a little in the middle, and the windows were dusty and slightly fogged. But the porch light was on, casting a weak glow on the wooden steps. I parked my car and grabbed my bags, locking the doors before walking up to the porch. The air was sharp and cold, biting at my skin. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and reached for the rusty old key hanging on the nail beside the door. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the smell of wood smoke and damp earth hitting me like a wave. It felt welcoming but strange at the same time, like the cabin was holding its breath, waiting for something. Inside, the cabin was small. A single room with a wood stove in the corner, a rickety table and a couple of chairs, and a narrow bed pushed up against one wall. There was a thin layer of dust over everything, and the floorboards creaked under my feet as I moved around, unpacking my things slowly. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and somewhere far off a bird cried out, the sound hollow in the growing darkness. I lit a fire in the stove and sat by the flickering flames, feeling the warmth spread through the room. Outside, night fell fully, and the forest turned black. The silence deepened, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig or the distant howl of an animal. I'd read somewhere that deep in the woods, your own breathing sounds loud, and it's easy to start hearing things that aren't there. I told myself it was just the wind moving the branches. After a while, I decided to stretch my legs and step outside for some fresh air. The porch light barely cut through the darkness, and I could see nothing beyond the small clearing where the cabin stood. The forest pressed close, trees standing like silent sentinels around the clearing's edge. As I turned to head back inside, I noticed something. A figure, just barely visible, standing at the edge of the clearing, where the trees met the open ground. For a moment, I thought it was a trick of the shadows. But no, there it was, a man tall and thin, standing motionless. His clothes looked worn and dirty, like he'd been living outdoors for a long time. His head was slightly tilted, and though I couldn't see his face clearly in the dark, there was something wrong about his posture, stiff and unnatural. I froze, my heart hammered in my chest, but I told myself he must be someone else's guest or a local passing by. The area was known for hikers and hunters after all. I was about to call out when he suddenly turned and slipped silently back into the trees, vanishing as quickly as he had appeared. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the cabin, every distant rustle of leaves made me jump. I kept imagining that strange man's face, twisted and unreadable in the shadows. The next morning, The sunlight streaming through the windows didn't help me shake the unease. I told myself I was being silly, just tired from the drive and too alone in the woods. During the day, I walked the trails nearby, trying to keep my mind busy. The forest was beautiful and quiet, but every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of something moving between the trees, something too fast and too silent to be an animal. Twice I found footprints, long and thin, bigger than a man's but with strange shapes pressed into the dirt, like claws or something sharp. By the time I got back to the cabin that afternoon, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it when I came out. A cold wave rolled through me. Inside, the place looked untouched except for one thing. My backpack, which I'd left on the floor near the bed, was now zipped open and empty. My phone and wallet were gone. Panic bubbled in my chest. I checked the windows, all closed and locked. The cabin had no other doors. Whoever had been here had to have come through the front. I didn't dare stay inside. Grabbing a small flashlight from the kitchen drawer, I stepped back outside. The forest seemed darker now, as if the trees had closed ranks and swallowed the daylight whole. I scanned the edges of the clearing and saw footprints again. Fresh this time. The same strange prints, leading off into the woods. The unease turned to fear. I should have left right then, driven back to town and called the police, but something made me stay. I told myself I needed to find my things. The sun was dipping fast when I followed the footprints into the woods. The air was colder here, and the underbrush thick with thorny bushes and dead leaves. Every step felt like it took me deeper into something I couldn't understand. The forest was quiet except for my own breathing and the sound of my feet crushing twigs. After walking for what felt like an hour, I reached a small clearing. The ground here was bare dirt, scattered with scraps of cloth and old cans. It looked like someone had been living here or camping out. In the middle of the clearing, a small fire pit held blackened stones, cold now, and around it were pieces of broken wood and rusted tools. Against a tree leaned a tattered backpack, one that looked very much like mine. I hurried over and checked inside. My phone, wallet, and a few other things I'd thought lost were there, but not everything. A small notebook I'd brought along was missing. I sat down, trying to calm my racing heart, when movement in the shadows caught my eye. A man stepped out from behind a tree. It was him, the same weird-looking man from the night before. His face was gaunt, pale, with sunken eyes that looked like they hadn't seen sunlight in months. His clothes hung off his thin frame, torn and stained. He didn't say anything or make a move. He just stood there, watching. I didn't feel safe. I stood up slowly and backed away. The man took a step forward, slow and deliberate. I turned and ran back the way I came, branches whipping my face, roots catching my feet. Behind me, I heard the crunch of leaves, the soft but steady sound of footsteps. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until the clearing was far behind me. When I finally stopped, my chest heaving, I realized I was completely lost. The trees looked all the same, and I had no idea which way led back to the cabin. For hours, I stumbled through the forest, moving blindly through the dark. My flashlight battery died early, leaving me with nothing but moonlight and fear. I kept thinking about the man, what he wanted, why he was here, living alone and watching the cabin. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I collapsed at the base of a tree. Sleep came in restless waves, and when dawn finally broke, I woke to the sound of an engine. I followed the noise and soon found a dirt road, the same one I had come in on. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, parked just where I'd left it. Inside, I locked the doors, started the engine, and didn't look back. As I drove away, the forest seemed to close behind me. I didn't know who that man was or why he was living out there, but one thing was certain: I wasn't going back. The cabin, the woods, that strange figure, they all belonged to a world I didn't want to be a part of anymore. I never found out what that man's story was, and maybe it's better that way. Sometimes, the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts, but people who live quietly in the shadows, watching and waiting, so close you can feel their eyes, but too far away to understand. I told my uncle about the broken lock and missing things. He just nodded and said the cabin had been left unused for a long time, that sometimes people passed through. Sometimes they didn't leave. I never stayed there again. Instead, I kept to the roads, to places with other people around. Because some places, some people are better left alone. The road that led to the cabin was narrow and barely more than a dirt path. Twisting through thick woods where the trees crowded in so tightly, it felt like they were trying to keep the sky from peeking through. I had driven this road many times before, but each trip still unsettled me a little, especially as the sun dipped lower and the shadows grew longer. That afternoon, the weather was clear, but the forest around me looked heavy, like it was holding its breath. I was alone, which was the whole point. The cabin had no cell service, no internet, no distractions, just the way I wanted it. A place to disconnect, to get away from noise, deadlines, and the constant pull of other people's lives. The small wooden cabin sat at the end of the path, tucked against a hillside with a little stream running nearby. It was old, built decades ago, but sturdy. The paint was peeling, and the roof sagged a bit in the middle, but it felt solid and safe enough. The porch creaked as I stepped out of my truck, the air smelling of pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that makes you feel like you're deep inside nature, far from everything. Inside, the cabin was dark, warmed by a small wood stove that I had started burning earlier. I liked the quiet crackle of the fire, the way it made the room feel alive without any noise beyond that. The windows were covered with thick curtains, blocking the outside world. The only light was the amber glow from the stove and the fading daylight sneaking through the edges. I moved slowly, unpacking my things, laying out a few groceries on the small kitchen table. The room was sparse, just the essentials. A cot, a small table, some shelves with canned food and old cooking pots. The walls were rough wood, with knots and grain lines that told stories of the trees they came from. Felt primitive, but in a good way. Real. Honest. After making a simple dinner, I sat by the stove with a mug of black coffee, listening. Outside, the forest was alive with sounds. Leaves rustling, small animals scurrying, the distant call of a bird settling in for the night. But there was something else too, something quieter, just beyond the edge of hearing. Felt like the forest was watching. As night fell fully, I closed the curtains and settled into my cot, the fire still glowing low. The silence inside was thick, but not empty. It was the kind of silence that lets you hear every tiny noise. Creaks from the old wood, the soft drip of condensation from the roof, the faint whistle of wind through cracks. I tried to focus on my breathing, slow and steady, but my mind wouldn't stop wandering. At some point, I heard a noise outside, not a big one, but enough to pull me out of the calm. It was soft, a scraping sound, like something dragging against the dirt or rocks. My heart picked up a little, but I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal. Still, I grabbed the flashlight from the table and stepped outside. The air was cold, sharper than I expected. The moon was high and full, casting silvery light on the ground and making long shadows that looked like fingers reaching from the trees. I swept the flashlight beam around the clearing near the cabin, checking for anything unusual. The ground was disturbed near the edge of the tree line, patches where the dirt looked freshly moved, like something had been digging or digging had been done recently. I stood still and listened, my breath visible in the cold air. Then I heard it again, the scraping sound, but closer now, coming from the woods. I shone the light in that direction, but all I saw were dark trunks and thick brush. I waited, the beam fixed on the spot, but nothing moved, just the quiet forest. I went back inside and locked the door, double-checking the old latch. My fingers trembled slightly, but I told myself it was normal to feel uneasy out here alone. I made some tea, sat back down by the fire, and tried to lose myself in a book. But the feeling didn't go away. It sat heavy in my chest, like something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. Hours passed. The fire burned low. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling softly through the trees. Then came the sounds, the subtle, rhythmic tapping on the cabin walls. Not a branch hitting the roof or the side, but something deliberate like a finger drumming. I froze, listening to the pattern. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap. It wasn't random. I wanted to tell myself it was a bird or a branch, but the sound didn't fit. It was too regular, too intentional. I grabbed the flashlight again, preparing myself to look outside. As I opened the door, the cold night air hit me like a wall. The woods were silent now except for that tapping, which stopped the moment I stepped out. My light swept across the clearing and back into the forest. Nothing. No movement, no sound. The trees stood still. I felt eyes on me. Not human eyes, but something out there watching from the dark. My skin prickled with goosebumps. I closed the door quickly, bolting it tight. The tapping started again, but this time it came from the window nearest to the door. I moved slowly to the window and shone the light outside. A pair of dark shapes darted behind the trees. A small group of animals, maybe coyotes or raccoons. The tapping stopped. I sat back down, trying to calm myself. I kept the flashlight nearby, the door locked, and the fire alive. But I couldn't sleep. Every little sound made me jump. The wind, the snapping of twigs, the distant howl of some unknown creature. The forest seemed alive and awake, while I felt small and exposed inside my fragile cabin. As dawn began to creep over the horizon, the tension slowly lifted. The cold light of morning revealed the world clearly, stripping away the shadows that had made the night so unnerving. I stepped outside to find tracks around the cabin. Deer hoof prints, some smaller animal paw prints, and a few deep, wide prints that looked like a bear or a large dog. The ground where I had seen the disturbed dirt was clearly dug up in places. Not deep holes, but enough to suggest something had been rooting around, searching for food or shelter. I realized the tapping on the cabin must have been an animal trying to get in, maybe to escape the cold or to check if this place was safe. I stayed outside for a while, watching the forest wake up. Birds chirped loudly, squirrels scurried in the branches, and the sun started to warm the cold earth. The fear of the night still lingered inside me, but the morning light made the world seem more manageable, more understandable. That day, I took some time to reinforce the cabin. I nailed some extra boards over the windows, sealed gaps around the door with cloth and tape, and cleared the brush away from the cabin walls to reduce places animals could hide. I didn't want another night like the last. The rest of the week passed quietly. I found tracks regularly, signs of animals living their lives nearby, but they kept their distance. I learned to live with the sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the occasional call of a distant animal, the whisper of the wind through the pines. The cabin felt safer then, a small island of warmth and light amid the vast woods. On my last night, I sat outside on the porch, a blanket around my shoulders, staring up at the stars. The forest was calm, peaceful even. I realized that the fear I felt wasn't really about the animals or the dark. It was about being alone in a place that doesn't bend to human rules. A place that exists without us, indifferent to our presence. The cabin was old, the forest wild, and I was just a visitor passing through. I accepted that and found a strange kind of peace in it. When morning came, I packed up my things, locked the cabin carefully, and took the dirt road back out of the woods. Driving away, I looked back once at the trees standing tall against the sky. The cabin would stay there, holding its ground, waiting for the next person to come and sit with the silence. And I knew that no matter how scared I had been, I had faced the dark and the quiet and come out stronger for it. The sun had just slipped behind the jagged peaks when I pulled up the gravel driveway to the old cabin. The place sat at the edge of the forest, tucked in a small clearing where the trees thinned out just enough to catch the fading light. It was the kind of spot where the air smelled thick with pine and damp earth, the kind of silence that wasn't quiet but heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I'd been coming here alone for years, a refuge from the noise of the world, but this time something felt different from the moment I stepped out of the truck. The cabin was weathered, the wood gray and rough from years of sun and rain, but it stood solid, a low-slung box with a porch that wrapped halfway around. The windows caught the last streaks of daylight, reflecting the deep green of the forest behind. I set my pack down on the porch, the scrape of my boots against the wooden boards the only sound I made. The air was crisp, cooler than I expected for late afternoon, and the wind whispered softly through the needles of the nearby firs. I pulled the door open and stepped inside. The cabin smelled of old wood and faint smoke, the scent of countless winters burning pine logs in the stone fireplace. The room was small, a living area with a sagging couch, a rough wooden table, and a kitchen with mismatched dishes in open shelves. I liked it that way, simple, quiet, untouched by time. I flicked on the lantern and sat down at the table, watching as the soft yellow glow pushed back the shadows in the corners. Outside, the forest darkened quickly, the trees turning into solid black shapes against the fading sky. I could hear the distant call of a bird settling in for the night, the rustle of small animals moving in the underbrush. That peaceful, normal feeling settled over me, the kind I always chased in places like this. I had just started heating water for tea when I heard it. A sharp snap somewhere outside, like a branch breaking under a heavy paw. I froze, listening hard. The sound came again, closer this time. A heavy step, slow, deliberate. My heart jumped. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the noise wasn't right. It wasn't the light tap-tap-tap of small feet. It was deeper, heavier. The air around the cabin seemed to tighten. I went to the window, careful not to make a sound. Through the glass, the forest looked like a wall of black and green, the trees thick and unwelcoming. My breath fogged the glass for a moment. Then I saw it. A dark shape moving just beyond the tree-line, low and sleek, gliding silently between the trees. It stopped, just for a second, and I caught the flash of eyes, sharp and yellow, locked onto the cabin. My stomach twisted. It was a mountain lion. I didn't breathe. The animal didn't move for a long moment, just stared. Its body was lean and powerful, muscles rippling beneath tawny fur that blended perfectly with the shadows. Its tail twitched, long and thick, and I could see the way it flexed its paws, claws sheathed but ready. The silence stretched between us, taut and dangerous. Then it turned and slipped back into the trees without another sound. My heart was pounding now. I knew these cats were around here. I'd seen tracks near the cabin before, but never this close, never like this. I shut the curtains tight and locked the door, checking the windows to make sure they were latched. I sat back down at the table, trying to steady my breathing, but every creak of the cabin and whistle of the wind made me jump. Outside, the forest seemed alive with unseen movement. I could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs, soft but steady, circling the cabin. The mountain lion was out there, hunting or maybe just watching. The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I decided to light the fire in the hearth, hoping the warmth and light would keep whatever was outside at bay. The flames crackled to life, casting flickering shadows that danced on the walls. Still, the feeling of being watched never left. Every few minutes I would glance out the window, heart racing when I thought I saw something move just beyond the glow of the firelight. Night deepened, thick and impenetrable, until the forest around the cabin was swallowed by darkness. The only light came from the fire and the stars overhead, cold and distant. The mountain lion was patient. It knew this territory better than I ever would. I tried to focus on the fire, on the steady crackle of burning wood, but the sounds outside grew louder. The snapping of branches, the rustle of leaves, a low growl that vibrated through the ground. My skin prickled. The mountain lion wasn't just near. It was close, too close. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out onto the porch, shining the beam into the woods. The light caught nothing but trees and shadows. I shone it left, then right, my heart hammering in my chest. The cat's eyes reflected back at me for a moment, two glinting orbs just beyond the firelight. Then it vanished. I retreated inside and bolted the door again. The wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the cabin, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine needles. I could smell the animal now, sharp, musky, like sweat mixed with the wildness of the forest. Sleep was impossible. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move. I kept the fire burning low, just enough to push back the darkness, but not enough to attract attention. Hours passed like this, the mountain lion circling, stalking, waiting. At first light, I forced myself outside, stepping onto the porch with the first pale rays of the sun. The forest looked less menacing now, the shadows retreating and the air warming. I scanned the edge of the trees and saw the prints. Huge paw marks pressed deep into the soft soil, clear and fresh. The animal had been there all night. I knew I couldn't stay another night. The mountain lion was a predator, a perfect hunter, and I was an intruder in its home. I packed my gear quickly, trying not to make noise. The forest was waking up, birds calling and squirrels darting between branches. The feeling of being watched remained, but the threat had lessened with the light. As I loaded my truck, I glanced back once more toward the woods. For a long moment, I saw the cat's silhouette standing at the tree line, calm and powerful, watching me leave. Then it melted back into the forest, invisible again. Driving away, I kept the windows up and the doors locked. The memory of those yellow eyes stayed with me, a reminder that even in the quiet, peaceful places, the wild is always close, always watching, always waiting. The mountain lion didn't need to roar or chase to be terrifying. The silence, its patience, was enough, and that knowledge followed me far beyond the forest, long after the cabin was out of sight. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not the kind of silence you get when everything is peaceful and calm, but the kind that feels heavy and thick, like the air itself is holding its breath. It was late afternoon when I arrived at the cabin, deep in the woods, far from the nearest town or any sign of civilization. The road had been rough, just a narrow dirt track carved through dense pine trees that blocked the sky like a green ceiling. The sun was already low, slanting between the branches and casting long shadows over the mossy ground. I pulled up the truck and parked beside the cabin, a small wooden structure with faded brown paint peeling off the walls and a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The place looked abandoned, but I knew better. It belonged to my uncle, who had built it years ago as a weekend getaway spot. He had given me permission to stay there alone for a few days, saying it would be good for me to get away from the city and clear my head. I needed that. Life had been stressful lately, and the idea of being alone in the forest, away from the noise and chaos, felt like a relief. The first night was normal enough. I built a fire outside on the cracked stone hearth, cooked some canned chili over the flames, and sat in an old wooden chair on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest as darkness settled in. The wind rustled the leaves and pine needles, birds called softly in the distance, and somewhere far off, a stream babbled quietly. I felt calm, almost peaceful, but I noticed something odd even that first evening. Occasionally, just beyond the tree line, I thought I caught movement, shadows shifting between the trees. Nothing clear, just a quick flicker, like something watching me. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon and shrugged it off. The next day, I spent my time exploring the area around the cabin. The forest was thick with underbrush, low bushes, ferns, and fallen logs covered in moss and fungus. The air smelled of pine sap and damp earth. The ground was soft and springy underfoot, muffling my footsteps. I found an old dirt path that twisted deeper into the woods and followed it for maybe half a mile before the trees grew too thick and the path disappeared entirely. The forest floor was littered with pine cones, broken twigs, and scattered leaves. Occasionally, I'd see tracks, deer hoof prints, maybe coyote paw marks, but nothing that worried me. In the late afternoon, I returned to the cabin and started preparing dinner. As I cut vegetables with a small knife, I noticed the same uneasy feeling from last night creeping back. It was like being watched again. I paused and looked out the window. The forest was calm, but that feeling didn't go away. I didn't see anything, but I could feel eyes on me. The second night, things began to change. The silence was different. The sounds of the forest seemed muted, like the wildlife had gone quiet. Even the crickets weren't chirping. It was unnatural. Around midnight, I woke up because I heard something outside. A low growl, deep and guttural, that didn't sound like any animal I had ever heard. It sent a chill down my spine. I stayed frozen, listening. The growl came again, closer this time. I slipped out of bed quietly and grabbed my flashlight. The cabin was small, only one room with a tiny kitchen and a fold-out couch where I was sleeping. I opened the door carefully, the cold night air rushing in and smelling of pine and wet earth. The forest beyond was black, but the beam of my flashlight sliced through the darkness. I swept the light across the trees, searching. Nothing moved. But then, from the edge of the clearing, I caught a glimpse of a shape. A tall, broad figure standing just at the treeline. It was dark, almost blending into the shadows, but I could see the outline of something large and muscular. It wasn't human. The shape moved slowly, almost casually, then disappeared behind a tree. My heart pounded in my chest. I wanted to convince myself it was a bear or a large dog, but the shape was upright, too tall and broad for any normal animal. I shut the door quickly and locked it, retreating to my bed. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks in the dark. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I woke to footprints in the soft dirt near the cabin. They were huge, much bigger than any human footprints. The shape was elongated, with claw marks at the edges, and the stride between prints was long. I took pictures with my phone, my hands shaking. My logical mind said it had to be a bear, but the prints didn't match anything I'd seen before. They looked too strange, too elongated, with a kind of human-like quality to them. I didn't want to stay anymore, but the dirt road was still several miles away, and the truck was parked far enough that I couldn't just run out. Besides, I told myself, maybe it was some rare animal or a coyote that had walked strangely. Maybe I was overreacting. The third night was worse. I barely slept. Around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a deep, snarling howl that came from just outside the cabin. It was long and loud, echoing through the forest. It wasn't a wolf or coyote. It was something else, something bigger. I stayed as still as possible, holding my breath and listening. Then I heard footsteps, heavy, slow, and deliberate, circling the cabin. The sound of twigs snapping underfoot, dry leaves crunching. My flashlight's batteries were dead, and I hadn't brought any spare. The cabin's windows were thin and old, offering no real protection. I could see the shadow moving around the edge of the porch. It was close. I grabbed the old hunting rifle from the corner, loaded it, and sat waiting in the dark. The noise circled for what felt like an hour, the low growls mixing with slow breaths and heavy steps. Then it stopped. Silence again. When morning came, I was exhausted and shaken. I dared not go outside for hours. When I finally did, the ground around the cabin was disturbed, like something had dug and clawed at the earth. There were more of those strange footprints, and some tufts of dark fur stuck in the bark of a tree. I packed my things as quickly as I could that day, but I kept hearing sounds, distant but clear. The crunch of leaves, deep guttural breathing, low growls. I was sure it was following me. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat with the rifle beside me, every shadow making me jump. The door rattled once, then again. Something big was trying to get in. I held my breath, ready to shoot. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and a loud thud hit the roof. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it outside. There, on the porch, was the figure again. This time, I saw it clearly. It stood upright like a man but was covered in thick dark fur. Its head was like a dog's. Long snout, sharp teeth, and glowing yellow eyes that fixed on me with intelligence. The hands were large and clawed, gripping the porch rail. It didn't move for a moment, just stared. Then it turned and disappeared into the woods. I didn't wait. At first light, I jumped in my truck and sped down the dirt road, not looking back until I reached the main highway. Days passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept seeing flashes of those yellow eyes in my dreams. I never went back to the cabin. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a quiet escape from the constant noise of the city, a break from work, and the perfect chance to get away from everything. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor, with nothing but the forest stretching out all around it. Just me and a couple of old friends, all eager to reconnect and relax for a few days. The drive up had been long but scenic. We passed rolling hills and quiet, winding roads that seemed to get narrower with every turn, until we finally reached the cabin. It was a small, rustic place, with peeling wood on the outside and a steep, pitched roof that looked like something out of an old postcard. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, but not in the kind of way that makes you run in fear. It was charming in a way, like a forgotten piece of the past. We were ready for the weekend. After unloading our gear, we all took a moment to appreciate the quiet. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves and the occasional bird call in the distance. It was perfect, almost too perfect, but we were all so eager to be away from the chaos of everyday life that we didn't think much about it. The first night passed without incident. We ate a simple meal of grilled food over an open fire, shared some drinks, and swapped old stories from our high school days. The usual fun stuff. We even went for a short hike before dark, just to stretch our legs after the long drive. The sun set early, and by the time we got back to the cabin, the forest had already swallowed the light, leaving only the glow of the fire to keep us company. The second night was different, though. That's when things started to feel off. It started with the quiet. The fire crackled, and the wind blew through the trees, but something about the stillness felt unnatural. I had a strange sense of being watched, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing but the blackness of the woods. I brushed it off. My friends were still chatting around the fire, oblivious to anything strange. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. At one point, I went inside the cabin to grab another drink. The place was small and cozy, with wooden floors and a large stone fireplace. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I stood in the doorway, looking out the window toward the forest, I thought I saw something move in the distance. It was quick, just a flash of shadow, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I peered harder into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Maybe it was a deer, or maybe I was just tired. I didn't mention it to anyone when I went back outside. The night grew colder, and the air felt thicker. The fire burned low, and the chatter around the campfire began to fade. Everyone seemed to be winding down, ready for bed. But just as I was about to go inside, I heard something. It was a soft, rustling sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. This wasn't the soft shuffle of a small animal. It was something heavier, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I turned to my friend, Nick, who had been sitting closest to me. I could see the same concern in his eyes, a look that mirrored what I was feeling. We both listened, trying to figure out what it was. The rustling stopped, but the sense of something being there, watching us, remained. We stood up, both of us unsure of what to do. Probably just a deer, Nick muttered, but his voice didn't have the same confidence as usual. It's probably nothing. I nodded, though I wasn't so sure. I didn't believe in supernatural stuff, no ghosts or spirits, but that didn't mean I wasn't afraid. Fear isn't always logical. Sometimes you just feel it in your gut. We all eventually headed inside. The cabin was warm, and we quickly made ourselves comfortable, pulling out sleeping bags and settling down for the night. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the nagging sense that something was out there. I heard things outside, but I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or something else. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to a strange sound in the middle of the night. It wasn't the wind or the usual night noises. It was a scratching sound, slow and methodical, like something was trying to dig into the cabin itself. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was coming from outside or inside the cabin. The sound continued, getting louder, and I could feel my heart racing. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. This was different. I got up quietly, careful not to wake the others. The moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. I moved to the door and peeked out into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the noise. First, I saw nothing, just the usual trees and the slight sway of the branches in the wind. But then, My eyes locked onto something that made my blood run cold. There, standing just outside the edge of the firelight, was a figure. It wasn't a man, but it wasn't an animal either. It was tall, unnaturally so, and it seemed to sway in the shadows as if it was made of them. Its limbs were long, too long, and bent at odd angles, like a spider's legs. Its skin, or whatever covered its body, was pale and stretched tight over its bones, with patches of dark, mottled coloring. It had no clothes, no face, just a smooth, featureless head that seemed to reflect the moonlight in a sickly way. It was like looking at a thing from a nightmare, too grotesque to be real. Yet there it was. Couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The creature's head slowly turned toward the cabin. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, black pits of emptiness that seemed to suck in the light around them. It didn't blink, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at me. And then it began to move, slowly at first, dragging its long limbs over the forest floor. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, sliding across the earth in an unnatural way, like it wasn't bound by the laws of gravity or nature. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest, and I realized I had to do something. It wasn't a deer or a raccoon or anything normal. This thing was not right. I moved to wake up Nick, but before I could, there was a loud crash from outside. The creature had slammed its arm into a tree, knocking it over with an impossible amount of force. It made a horrible, scraping noise as it slid across the ground, heading straight for the cabin. I had no choice. I had to warn everyone. "Nick," I hissed, shaking him awake. "Get up now." He groggily sat up, blinking in confusion. "What's going on?" "Get to the back door. Now," I whispered urgently. We didn't have time to argue. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. We were miles from any cell towers. The others woke up at the noise, their faces pale with fear. We all scrambled, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the creature outside was getting closer. I could hear its movements, scraping against the earth like claws dragging over stone. Then there was a sound from the roof, a low, almost guttural noise, like something scraping against the shingles. I couldn't help but glance up at the ceiling, wondering if whatever it was had somehow made its way up there. The scratching noise continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. It was closing in on us, circling the cabin, testing our defenses. We bolted for the back door, not bothering to look out the windows anymore. We ran through the dark woods, the trees whipping by, branches snapping under our feet. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding in my chest, and looked back toward the cabin. The creature was gone. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. The others were shaken, terrified, but no one spoke about what we had seen. What could we say? No one would believe us. The next day, we went back to the cabin. Everything seemed normal, too normal. There was no sign of what had happened. No tracks, no broken trees, no evidence of the creature. It was like nothing had happened at all. But I knew what I had seen. It was real. We left shortly after that, and I never went back. I don't know what that creature was, but I know it wasn't something I'd ever want to see again. I'm still not sure what it was doing in those woods, or why it was so interested in us, but I've never forgotten that night. It's been years now, but every time I think about it, I get the same feeling I had back then. Like something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I hope I never have to face it again. It was late October when I decided to spend a weekend alone in the cabin. I needed a break from everything: the city noise, work stress, and endless distractions. The cabin was nothing fancy. A small wooden structure tucked away in the thick forest about 2 hours from town. It was a place I had been to once or twice before with friends, but this time I wanted to be completely alone. I told myself it would be good for my mind and body to disconnect and breathe some fresh air. I packed a small bag with enough food for 2 days, some warm clothes, a few books, and a flashlight. The drive there was quiet, the roads winding through dense trees, their leaves mostly gone or turning rusty brown, crunching under my tires. When I finally pulled into the narrow dirt path leading to the cabin, the sun was already dipping behind the hills. I parked the car just outside a small clearing. The cabin sat against the edge of the woods, its dark, weathered wood blending into the shadows. It looked worn but sturdy. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and damp earth. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves in the gentle wind and the occasional call of a bird heading home. I grabbed my bag and locked the car, stepping up to the porch. The wooden steps creaked under my weight. The door was cold to the touch as I unlocked it, and I pushed it open to enter. Inside was a small living room with a fireplace, a kitchenette with basic supplies, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed. A window next to the bed looked out into the forest, and I noticed how the fading light barely reached inside. I put my bag down and started a fire in the fireplace, carefully arranging some dry wood and striking a match. The flames caught quickly, crackling and warming the room. Outside, the last light of day disappeared, and a thick darkness took over the forest. I sat near the fire with a book, but the silence of the place felt heavy, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I ate a simple dinner, canned beans and bread, then washed my plate in the small sink. The water came from a well, cold and clear. I filled a cup and sat back by the fire. The light flickered on the walls, casting moving shadows that made the cabin feel alive in a strange way. I looked out the window and saw nothing but blackness, trees standing still like silent guards. As night deepened, I decided to get ready for bed. I lit the old oil lamp on the table, the warm yellow glow filling the room. I changed into warm clothes and crawled under the thick blanket on the bed. Outside, the wind picked up, howling softly through the trees. The sound was soothing at first, but after a while, it started to feel different, sharper, colder, almost like something was moving in the woods. I lay still, listening to every sound. The occasional snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. But then, I thought I heard something closer. A slow, heavy step somewhere beyond the edge of the clearing, where the trees grew thicker. My heart picked up. I told myself it was probably just a deer or some other animal passing through, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. I reached over and grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness outside the window, sweeping over the trees and the clearing. I saw nothing but shadows. The wind died down for a moment, and the forest fell completely silent, as if holding its breath again. Then I heard it, a soft, crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves, moving slowly around the cabin. I held my breath, staring out the window, flashlight ready. The steps stopped suddenly, right outside the porch. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I felt the presence like a weight pressing against the glass. I wanted to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray dog, but the steps were too heavy, too deliberate. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was safe inside, the door locked, the windows shut, but my fingers trembled as I gripped the flashlight. The steps moved again, slowly pacing the edge of the clearing, circling the cabin. I heard a low, guttural noise, almost like a growl mixed with a breath. It wasn't an animal sound I knew. The air felt colder, and the silence between the sounds was thick with tension. I sat frozen, trying to listen, trying to understand what was out there. My mind raced, thinking about the stories I had heard of wild animals getting close to cabins, or worse, of people living rough in the woods, wandering close to camps and homes. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps began to retreat, moving away through the underbrush. The growling stopped. I waited for a long time, holding the flashlight tight, staring out the window until I was sure it was gone. I closed the curtains slowly and blew out the oil lamp, plunging the room into near darkness except for the dying fire in the hearth. I lay back down, pulling the blanket tight around me. My heart still hammered, and I kept listening for any sounds. The wind picked up again, louder this time, rattling the cabin's wooden walls and roof. Sleep came in short, uneasy bursts. Every time I started to drift off, the creaking of the cabin or a sudden snap outside jolted me awake. I kept the flashlight on the floor next to the bed, ready to grab it. In the early hours before dawn, I woke up suddenly to a loud banging noise at the front door. My heart stopped. I sat up, listening. The banging came again, slower and heavier. Someone, or something, was pounding on the door, trying to get in. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it toward the door, but I couldn't see anything outside through the small window next to it. I tried to tell myself it was a branch caught in the wind or maybe a loose shutter, but the sound was too forceful, too deliberate. The pounding went on for several seconds before stopping abruptly. I stayed awake, holding my breath, until the first light of morning peeked through the window. The forest outside looked calm again, peaceful, as if nothing had happened. When I finally got up, I checked the door and windows. Everything was locked tight, no sign of damage. Outside on the porch, there were heavy footprints in the soft earth. Large, uneven prints that didn't look like any animal I recognized. They circled around the porch, leading away into the woods. I packed my bag quickly, my hands still shaking. I didn't want to stay another night. I locked the cabin door, climbed into my car, and drove away as fast as I could without losing control on the dirt road. Looking back once, I saw the cabin disappear into the trees, quiet again, but I knew it wasn't empty. Whatever had been there wasn't gone for good, and I wasn't coming back to find out. The whole weekend had been meant to be a peaceful escape, but it turned into something else. A reminder that some places are best left alone, and that the woods hold secrets you don't want to meet face to face. I never told anyone about what happened, not in detail. I didn't want people to think I was crazy or exaggerating, but every time I'm near the forest now, I feel that same weight, that same cold watching me from the shadows. The cabin was just a place, but what was outside that cabin that night? That's the part one can't forget. I don't usually write down things like this. I'm not the kind of person who gets scared easily, and I've never believed in anything weird or strange out in the woods. But what happened last summer, during that trip to the cabin, changed the way I see things. I still can't explain it, and it doesn't make sense. Maybe writing it all out will help me understand, or at least get it off my chest. The cabin was this old, rustic place my friend Jake's family owned. It was tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest town or road. To get there, we had to drive for an hour on a gravel road that slowly disappeared into a narrow dirt track, winding through tall pines and thick brush. When we finally pulled up, the sun was just starting to dip below the treetops. The sky was turning a soft orange pink, and everything smelled like pine needles and wet earth. The cabin itself looked like it hadn't changed much in decades. The wood was weathered and gray, with patches of moss growing on the roof. The porch sagged a little on one side, and a rusty old swing hung from one of the big trees nearby. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of must and wood smoke. There was a small fireplace, a kitchen with a rusty stove, and some old furniture covered in dust and worn blankets. It had a quiet, peaceful feeling, the kind of place that made you want to sit still and listen to the sounds of the forest. We spent the first day exploring the area, walking on narrow trails that twisted between the trees and crossed little creeks. The forest was alive with birds and insects, and everything felt normal and safe. At night, the woods seemed calm and dark, but nothing felt strange. I liked the quiet. The only odd thing was a feeling I couldn't quite put my finger on, like something was watching, just out of sight. The second day, I decided to take a walk alone, wanting to get some fresh air and maybe catch some photos of the forest. I told Jake where I was going and promised to be back before dark. The trail I picked was a little rougher, narrower, and less traveled. After walking for about 20 minutes, I came to a small clearing with a rocky outcrop on one side. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting long shadows that danced on the ground. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shape half hidden behind a cluster of bushes. It was tall, maybe 6 or 7 feet, standing upright on 2 legs. But the way it moved was strange, awkward and slow, like it wasn't used to walking that way. Its arms hung low, almost dragging along the ground. The skin, as far as I could see, was pale but mottled, with patches that looked rough or scaly. It had a long neck, bent forward slightly, and the head was too big for its body, round and bulbous with eyes that seemed to glint in the dim light. It didn't make a sound, and I froze. My heart hammered so loud I was sure it would hear it. I wanted to move, to run back to the cabin, but my legs were heavy, stuck to the spot. The creature stayed still for a moment, then slowly turned its head toward me, eyes locking onto mine. I don't know how long that moment lasted. Maybe seconds, maybe minutes. Then it started moving, deliberately but without rush, stepping out from behind the bushes and into the clearing. I could see it fully now. The arms were long and thin, the fingers almost too long and jointed strangely, ending in blunt nails that looked cracked or dirty. Its legs were bent oddly at the knees, almost like a bird's, but it didn't hop or flap. The skin was thin in some places, stretched tight over bones and muscles, but in others it hung loose like it had lost weight or was sick. It wasn't an animal I recognized, and it wasn't human. But it also didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen in the woods. It was something else, something that didn't belong. I don't remember moving, but suddenly I was turning and running back the way I came. I didn't look back until I was about 100 yards down the trail. When I glanced over my shoulder, it was gone. No sign of it anywhere. The bushes were still, the forest silent except for the usual sounds of birds and wind. Back at the cabin, I told Jake what I saw, but he just laughed it off. Probably some deer standing weird or something, he said, but I knew what I saw. I wasn't imagining it. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those pale, shiny eyes staring at me. The slow movements, the long, strange fingers. I kept thinking about what it was and where it could have come from. The next day, I wanted to prove it wasn't just a trick of my imagination. I went back to the clearing to look for signs, footprints, broken branches, anything. The ground was soft and damp from last night's rain, so I expected to see tracks. But all I found were normal animal prints: deer, squirrels, raccoons, and nothing else. I looked closely along the edges of the clearing. There were scratch marks on some tree trunks, deep and rough, not from deer or bears. They looked like something sharp and heavy had scraped them, maybe claws or nails. The marks were fresh, not old and faded. I took pictures with my phone and brought them back to Jake. This time he looked more serious, but still didn't want to believe it. We decided to check the area one more time together. We set out in the afternoon, walking slowly and keeping our eyes open. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects seemed muted or missing. As we reached the clearing, I felt the same uneasy feeling from before, like eyes were watching us from the shadows. Then, just beyond the clearing, we saw it again. It was crouched behind a fallen log, watching us. The same pale, weird shape, hunched over with those long arms folded close to its body. It didn't move when we approached, just stayed still, eyes following us. I could see its chest rising and falling slowly with each breath. We stopped and looked at each other, unsure what to do next. The creature didn't make a sound or run away. It just stayed there, like it was waiting for something. I felt a cold chill crawl up my back. Without thinking, I snapped a few photos and started to back away slowly. Jake followed. As we turned to leave, the creature stood up suddenly, very fast for its size, and disappeared into the thick brush like a shadow melting away. We didn't speak on the way back to the cabin. Neither of us knew what we'd seen or what it meant. That night, we kept the fire burning bright and didn't go outside again. The next morning, Jake's parents called. They wanted us to come home early, saying there had been some strange reports from the nearby town about animals acting weird and some strange sounds heard in the forest. Nobody knew what caused it, but some people were scared. We packed up quickly, not wanting to stay any longer. As we drove away from the cabin, I kept looking out the window at the trees passing by. I wondered if the creature was still out there, watching, waiting in the shadows. I haven't been back since. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I still see those pale eyes in my mind. I don't know what it was or where it came from, but I know it was real, and I know I never want to see it again. I decided to take a weekend trip alone to a remote cabin I'd rented deep in the woods. It was early autumn, and the air was already sharp and cold, even during the day. The plan was simple: get away from the noise of the city, spend a couple of days reading and hiking, and just be alone with nature. I didn't expect it to be anything more than that. The drive to the cabin took longer than I thought. The last 20 miles were on a rough dirt road, winding through dense forest with tall pine trees crowding in on both sides. The sun was already dipping low by the time I reached the small clearing where the cabin stood. It was nothing fancy, just a plain wooden structure, about 20 feet by 30, with a front porch and a single chimney. The paint was peeling, and the windows looked a little dusty, but it seemed sturdy enough. I parked the car just off the porch, grabbed my bags, and unlocked the door. The smell of old wood and a faint mustiness filled the air inside. The cabin was sparsely furnished, with a small table and 2 chairs, a couch with some blankets thrown over it, a wood stove in the corner, and a narrow bed pushed against one wall. There was a tiny kitchen area with a sink, an old gas stove, and a cupboard with some canned food and a few dishes. No electricity, no running water, just the basics. I set my bags down and took a deep breath. The silence was thick, almost too quiet. I was so used to the background hum of city life that the stillness felt strange, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I decided to start a fire. The previous guests had left some firewood stacked neatly outside, so I carried in a few logs and some kindling. After a couple of tries, I got the stove going. The warmth filled the room, the crackle of the fire the only sound breaking the quiet. I took off my jacket, unpacked my things, and made myself a simple dinner with some canned beans heated on the stove. After eating, I pulled one of the blankets over my legs and sat near the fire with a book. Outside, the sky was fading to deep blue, and the stars started to appear one by one. The woods beyond the clearing were black and dense, trees standing tall like silent guards. As darkness fully settled, I closed the curtains to block out the deep blackness outside. The cabin felt smaller, more enclosed. I checked my phone, no signal. That was expected, but it added to the feeling of isolation. I put the phone away and decided to go to bed early. The long drive and fresh air had tired me out. The bed creaked under me as I lay down. The fire was still burning low in the stove, giving off a gentle heat and soft glow. I closed my eyes, ready to drift off. But then I heard something. At first, it was faint. A soft rustling outside, like the sound of dry leaves or small branches brushing against each other. I thought maybe it was the wind, but the night was still. The trees were motionless. The sound grew closer, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. My heart started pounding. I sat up and listened, trying to tell if it was someone walking near the cabin. The porch creaked faintly under a weight, and then the footsteps stopped. Dead silence again. I told myself it must be an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound of the steps was heavier, more careful, not like an animal padding around. And it felt like someone was standing just outside the door. I stayed very still, holding my breath, waiting. After what felt like minutes, the footsteps moved away slowly, crunching on dry leaves and twigs. I didn't move until the sound was gone, replaced again by the quiet night. The next morning, I decided to check around the cabin to see if anything was disturbed. Outside, the air was crisp and fresh. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call. Near the porch, I saw footprints. One set, large and heavy, leading up to the door and stopping there. The prints were fresh. Whoever had been out there hadn't come far. I scanned the surrounding area but saw no other tracks. They had come, stepped to the door, and turned away. I didn't want to admit it, but I felt uneasy. I had told no one I was coming here. There was no reason for anyone to be near this place. The cabin was out of the way, and the nearest neighbor was miles away. That day, I kept busy hiking a marked trail I found on a crumpled map left in the cabin. The forest was beautiful, with golden leaves falling all around and crisp air filling my lungs. But even as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept hearing noises, branches breaking off a distance, twigs snapping underfoot, birds suddenly flying away. Every time I stopped, the sound stopped. I was alone, but it felt like someone or something was tracking me. When I got back to the cabin at dusk, I noticed something else. One of the windows was slightly open, just a crack. I was sure I had closed it the night before. I closed it firmly, checking all the doors and windows again. I started the fire stove and stayed by it as long as I could, my eyes on the window. That night was harder to sleep. Every sound outside was sharper, louder. Every shadow in the dark seemed to shift just enough to catch my attention. At some point, I heard voices, whispers maybe, just barely audible. But there was no one else around. I told myself I must be imagining it, hearing things in the silence. The next morning, I packed a small bag. I decided I wasn't going to stay another night. I ate quickly and started my car, but it wouldn't start. The battery was dead. Panic started to rise. No signal on my phone. No one for miles. I went back to the cabin to see if I could find anything useful. As I entered, I noticed footprints again. More of them, this time going around the cabin, as if someone had been circling it all night. I looked closer and saw something else. Marks on the door frame. Scratches, like someone had tried to pry the door open. That was when I realized it wasn't just someone wandering by. Someone had tried to get in. I didn't want to stay inside, but it was the only shelter around. I sat down, heart racing, looking for something to defend myself with. There was an old hunting knife on the kitchen counter, left behind by the owners. I picked it up and stayed close to the stove fire. The afternoon passed slowly. Every noise outside set my nerves on edge. The sun began to drop again, and the cold seeped in deeper. When night fell, I barricaded the door with a wooden chair and pushed furniture against the windows. I sat on the floor, back against the wall, knife in hand. Hours passed. The forest outside was alive with night sounds. Owls hooting, branches swaying, distant rustling. Suddenly, I heard it again. Footsteps outside, slow and careful. Then, something heavy slammed against the door. I held my breath, gripping the knife tightly. The door shook from another hit, wood creaking. Someone was trying to break in. I yelled at the top of my lungs, hoping to scare whoever it was. But the sounds didn't stop. They kept hitting the door, more forceful now, desperate. My mind raced. I looked around for an escape, but the porch was dark, and the forest beyond was thick and deep. I was trapped. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the banging stopped. The footsteps moved away, slower, retreating into the woods. I stayed frozen for a long time, listening until every sound faded. When the dawn came, pale and weak through the curtains, I gathered my courage. I unlocked the door, carefully stepped outside, and looked around. No one was there. The footprints from the night before were gone, washed away by an early morning drizzle. I knew I couldn't stay. I needed to get help. I walked down the dirt road to a spot where my phone finally caught a weak signal. I called the local sheriff's office, explained everything I'd seen and heard, and asked for someone to come check the cabin. By mid-morning, a deputy arrived in a pickup truck. He listened carefully, examined the door and the window, and took photos of the footprints and scratches. He told me that people sometimes camp illegally in those woods, or worse, squatters looking for a place to hide. They can be dangerous if confronted. I was relieved when he said he'd drive me back to town. As we left, I glanced back at the cabin. The peaceful woods looked innocent again in daylight, but I knew the truth. The cabin wasn't just an empty building in the woods. For one night, it was a place someone had wanted to take over, and I was lucky to have gotten away. After that trip, I never went back to that part of the forest. I didn't need to. Some places are better left alone. The sky was overcast the day I arrived at the cabin, the kind of dull gray that presses down on you like a heavy blanket. I pulled up on the narrow dirt road, my car crunching over the gravel and fallen leaves. The cabin sat back a good distance from the road, almost swallowed by the tall pines and thick underbrush that stretched in every direction. It was old, no doubt about that. The wooden siding was weathered, gray with age, and the roof sagged slightly near the chimney. It looked like it had been there forever, forgotten by time. I'd rented it for a week to get away from everything, to clear my head, but as soon as I stepped out of the car, a strange chill ran down my spine. The air smelled cold and damp, like the forest had been holding onto the rain that had fallen earlier in the week. I took my bags and made my way down the narrow path toward the front porch. The steps creaked beneath my feet as I climbed up and pushed open the door. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and dust mixed with the faint trace of pine from the forest outside. The floorboards were uneven, and the walls were lined with faded wallpaper that peeled at the corners. It was simple but cozy in its own way. There was a stone fireplace against one wall, with a rusted metal grate in front. A few mismatched chairs sat around a worn wooden table, and a small kitchen sat off to the side, its cupboards half empty. I set my things down and moved to the window. The forest outside was thick and dark. No sounds came from anywhere except the occasional creak of a branch or the distant call of a crow. The stillness was oppressive, making me hyper-aware of every little noise. I told myself it was normal. This was the woods, after all. Quiet was to be expected. I spent the first day unpacking and settling in. I found a stack of old books on a shelf, most of them faded and cracked, clearly untouched for years. There was a radio on the kitchen counter, one of those old boxy ones with an antenna. I tried it, but only static came through. No signal. The cabin was too far out for cell service, too far from anything. I knew this going in, but the silence was heavier than I imagined. That night, I lit a fire in the fireplace. The flickering light cast shadows on the walls, making the room feel smaller, tighter. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and causing the pine branches to scrape against the cabin like fingernails. I sat in one of the chairs, wrapped in a blanket, and tried to read one of the books. The words blurred together, and my mind kept drifting to the dark forest beyond the glass. At some point, I stopped reading and just stared into the fire. The crackling flames made a soft noise, but it did little to chase away the silence. There was a feeling in the air, like something waiting just beyond the tree line. I shook the thought away. I was alone here, sure, but I was safe. The woods were quiet, nothing to worry about. Around midnight, I heard it. A noise outside, soft but deliberate. It started as a faint rustling, like something dragging across the ground. Then a low thump, repeated slowly and steadily. I froze, listening. The fire popped and hissed. I held my breath, straining to hear more. The noise moved closer, scraping against the side of the cabin, stopping just outside the window. My heart pounded in my chest as I crept to the window and peered out. The glass was fogged with condensation, but I could just make out shapes in the dark. The branches swayed in the wind, shadows shifting like living things. I squinted, trying to see clearly, but there was nothing there. No animals, no people. Just the trees, silent and still. I backed away from the window, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just a deer or some other animal. They were common in these woods. Still, the noise had sounded different, heavier, deliberate. Not the quick scamper of a small creature, but something larger, moving carefully. The rest of the night passed without incident, but I couldn't sleep. I lay on the creaky bed, staring up at the ceiling, listening for any more sounds. Every crack of the wood, every rustle of the wind made me jump. Dawn felt like it would never come. Morning brought a dull gray light through the window. I was exhausted but relieved to see the world outside still in place. The forest looked calm in the daylight, peaceful almost. I made a strong pot of coffee and sat on the porch, trying to settle my nerves. The air was cold but fresh, the smell of pine and earth grounding me. As the day wore on, I explored the area around the cabin. The trees were thick and close, the forest floor soft with moss and fallen leaves. I found an old path winding deeper into the woods, but it looked like it hadn't been used in years. Small animal tracks dotted the ground, but nothing larger. The silence was overwhelming, the kind that presses against your ears until every small sound is amplified. That night, I was more prepared. I locked all the doors and windows, pushed furniture against the front door, and set a heavy chair beneath the window. I kept the fire burning bright, the flickering flames offering a small comfort. Still, the noises started again. This time it wasn't just scraping or thumps. There were footsteps, heavy, slow steps circling the cabin, sometimes pausing, as if whatever was out there was trying to decide something. The sounds moved from one side of the cabin to the other, then back again. Sometimes a branch snapped sharply, close enough to make me flinch. I stayed still, listening, willing the footsteps to stop. The air grew colder, the night pressing in around me. My fingers clenched the armrest of my chair. I thought about calling for help, but the phone was useless here, and shouting into the night wouldn't bring anyone. Hours passed like this, the footsteps never quite leaving. When the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the sounds stopped. Silence fell again, thick and complete. I didn't sleep that morning. Instead, I packed a small bag with essentials: water, some food, a flashlight, and a pocket knife I found in the kitchen drawer. I needed to get out. I had told myself I could handle being alone, but the woods had other plans. I unlocked the front door and stepped outside, the cold morning air biting at my skin. The forest looked the same, but now every shadow seemed deeper, every tree a possible hiding place. I moved quickly down the path toward the road, glancing over my shoulder at the cabin, which sat still and quiet behind me. When I reached the road, I saw tire tracks in the dirt, fresh and wide. Someone else had been here recently, not just me. The thought made my stomach twist. I started walking faster, hoping to reach the main highway before nightfall. By the time I was a mile down the road, my legs ached and the sun was starting to dip low. I stopped by a large rock to catch my breath and check my phone again. Still no signal. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly on either side. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps, heavier this time, crunching leaves behind me. I didn't dare turn around. My heart pounded so loud I was sure whoever was there could hear it. I picked up my pace, breaking into a run despite the soreness in my muscles. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I could hear the heavy breathing now, ragged and uneven. My mind raced through every possible explanation, none of them good. I stumbled over a root and fell hard, scraping my hands on the rough bark of a tree. I scrambled to my feet, tears stinging my eyes from the pain and fear. I didn't look back, couldn't. I ran until I reached a small clearing where an old, rusted pickup truck sat abandoned. Its windows were broken, the bed full of leaves and debris. I climbed in, locking the door behind me and pulling my knees to my chest. My breath came in short gasps. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing. I waited, frozen. The silence was unbearable. After what felt like forever, I heard the footsteps retreat, slow and cautious, fading back into the trees. I stayed in the truck until the sun was fully up, watching the forest with wide eyes. When I finally got out, I ran toward the highway, which was just a few hundred yards away. A car passed by, and I waved frantically, relieved when it slowed and stopped. The driver called the police for me. Looking back from the safety of the road, the forest looked calm again, but I knew better. Whatever had been out there wasn't just a trick of the night or some animal. It was something watching, waiting. The cabin, the woods, they kept their secrets well. I never went back. The memory stayed with me, a quiet warning about how lonely the forest can be and how small you feel when the dark is closing in all around you. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a quiet escape from the constant noise of the city, a break from work, and the perfect chance to get away from everything. The cabin was tucked away deep in the woods, miles from the nearest neighbor, with nothing but the forest stretching out all around it. Just me and a couple of old friends, all eager to reconnect and relax for a few days. The drive up had been long but scenic. We passed rolling hills and quiet, winding roads that seemed to get narrower with every turn, until we finally reached the cabin. It was a small, rustic place, with peeling wood on the outside and a steep, pitched roof that looked like something out of an old postcard. The kind of place you'd expect to see in a horror movie, but not in the kind of way that makes you run in fear. It was charming in a way, like a forgotten piece of the past. We were ready for the weekend, After unloading our gear, we all took a moment to appreciate the quiet. The only sound was the rustling of the leaves and the occasional bird call in the distance. It was perfect, almost too perfect, but we were all so eager to be away from the chaos of everyday life that we didn't think much about it. The first night passed without incident. We ate a simple meal of grilled food over an open fire, shared some drinks, and swapped old stories from our high school days. The usual fun stuff. We even went for a short hike before dark, just to stretch our legs after the long drive. The sun set early, and by the time we got back to the cabin, the forest had already swallowed the light, leaving only the glow of the fire to keep us company. The second night was different, though. That's when things started to feel off. It started with the quiet. The fire crackled, and the wind blew through the trees, but something about the stillness felt unnatural. I had a strange sense of being watched, but whenever I turned around, there was nothing but the blackness of the woods. I brushed it off. My friends were still chatting around the fire, oblivious to anything strange. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. At one point, I went inside the cabin to grab another drink. The place was small and cozy, with wooden floors and a large stone fireplace. Nothing out of the ordinary. As I stood in the doorway, looking out the window toward the forest, I thought I saw something move in the distance. It was quick, just a flash of shadow, but it was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I peered harder into the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. Maybe it was a deer, or maybe I was just tired. I didn't mention it to anyone when I went back outside. The night grew colder, and the air felt thicker. The fire burned low, and the chatter around the campfire began to fade. Everyone seemed to be winding down, ready for bed. But just as I was about to go inside, I heard something. It was a soft rustling sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a fox or a raccoon. But then I heard it again, closer this time. This wasn't the soft shuffle of a small animal. It was something heavier, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I turned to my friend, Nick, who had been sitting closest to me. I could see the same concern in his eyes, a look that mirrored what I was feeling. We both listened, trying to figure out what it was. The rustling stopped, but the sense of something being there, watching us, remained. We stood up, both of us unsure of what to do. Probably just a deer, Nick muttered, but his voice didn't have the same confidence as usual. It's probably nothing. I nodded, though I wasn't so sure. I didn't believe in supernatural stuff, no ghosts or spirits. But that didn't mean I wasn't afraid. Fear isn't always logical. Sometimes you just feel it in your gut. We all eventually headed inside. The cabin was warm, and we quickly made ourselves comfortable, pulling out sleeping bags and settling down for the night. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I felt the nagging sense that something was out there. I heard things outside, but I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or something else. I must have eventually fallen asleep, because the next thing I remember is waking up to a strange sound in the middle of the night. It wasn't the wind or the usual night noises. It was a scratching sound, slow and methodical, like something was trying to dig into the cabin itself. I froze. I wasn't sure if it was coming from outside or inside the cabin. The sound continued, getting louder, and I could feel my heart racing. It wasn't an animal, at least not one I recognized. This was different. I got up quietly, careful not to wake the others. The moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows on the floor. I moved to the door and peeked out into the darkness, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the noise. First, I saw nothing, just the usual trees and the slight sway of the branches in the wind. But then, my eyes locked onto something that made my blood run cold. There, standing just outside the edge of the firelight, was a figure. It wasn't a man, but it wasn't an animal either. It was tall, unnaturally so, and it seemed to sway in the shadows as if it was made of them. Its limbs were long, too long, and bent at odd angles, like a spider's legs. Its skin, or whatever covered its body, was pale and stretched tight over its bones, with patches of dark, mottled coloring. It had no clothes, no face, just a smooth, featureless head that seemed to reflect the moonlight in a sickly way. It was like looking at a thing from a nightmare, too grotesque to be real. Yet there it was. Couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. The creature's head slowly turned toward the cabin. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, black pits of emptiness that seemed to suck in the light around them. It didn't blink, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at me. And then it began to move, slowly at first, dragging its long limbs over the forest floor. It wasn't walking, it was gliding, sliding across the earth in an unnatural way, like it wasn't bound by the laws of gravity or nature. I stepped back, heart pounding in my chest, and I realized I had to do something. It wasn't a deer or a raccoon or anything normal. This thing was not right. I moved to wake up Nick, but before I could, there was a loud crash from outside. The creature had slammed its arm into a tree, knocking it over with an impossible amount of force. It made a horrible, scraping noise as it slid across the ground, heading straight for the cabin. I had no choice. I had to warn everyone. "Nick," I hissed, shaking him awake. "Get up now." He groggily sat up, blinking in confusion. "What's going on?" "Get to the back door. Now," I whispered urgently. We didn't have time to argue. I grabbed my phone and tried to call 911, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. We were miles from any cell towers. The others woke up at the noise, their faces pale with fear. We all scrambled, trying to stay as quiet as possible, but the creature outside was getting closer. I could hear its movements, scraping against the earth like claws dragging over stone. Then there was a sound from the roof, a low, almost guttural noise, like something scraping against the shingles. I couldn't help but glance up at the ceiling, wondering if whatever it was had somehow made its way up there. The scratching noise continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. It was closing in on us, circling the cabin, testing our defenses. We bolted for the back door, not bothering to look out the windows anymore. We ran through the dark woods, the trees whipping by, branches snapping under our feet. We didn't stop until we reached the truck. I slammed the door behind me, heart pounding in my chest, and looked back toward the cabin. The creature was gone. We drove for hours, not stopping until we reached the nearest town. The others were shaken, terrified, but no one spoke about what we had seen. What could we say? No one would believe us. The next day, we went back to the cabin. Everything seemed normal, too normal. There was no sign of what had happened, no tracks, no broken trees, no evidence of the creature. It was like nothing had happened at all. But I knew what I had seen. It was real. We left shortly after that, and I never went back. I don't know what that creature was, but I know it wasn't something I'd ever want to see again. I'm still not sure what it was doing in those woods, or why it was so interested in us, but I've never forgotten that night. It's been years now, but every time I think about it, I get the same feeling I had back then. Like something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I hope I never have to face it again. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple. Escape the city, get away from the noise, the crowds, the constant buzz of life. I found a small cabin listed online, tucked away in a dense forest about 3 hours north of town. The photos showed a rustic wooden cabin, aged but solid, sitting near a small lake with thick trees surrounding it on all sides. No electricity, no internet, just peace and quiet. Perfect. I needed that. The drive itself was long but peaceful. I left early in the morning when the sun was barely up. The roads grew narrower and rougher as I moved farther from civilization. The highway gave way to winding gravel roads, potholes threatening the suspension every few feet. The forest pressed in on both sides, tall pines and oaks shading the sky. Sometimes I saw deer dart across the road or heard birds I couldn't identify calling in the distance. The further I went, the quieter it became. Not the quiet of silence, but the kind of quiet that fills your ears when there's nothing but trees and air around you. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, it was exactly like the photos. The wood was dark and weathered, the windows small and dirty, the porch sagging just a little on one side. A thin layer of moss clung to parts of the roof. Around the cabin, the ground was a mix of dirt, pine needles, and patches of grass. The lake was close, maybe 50 yards from the porch, still and reflecting the trees like a dark mirror. No sounds except for a soft wind through the branches and the occasional splash of a fish or frog. I unloaded my car slowly, trying to take in everything at once. I didn't expect it to feel this isolated. The kind of isolation that's heavy, like the air itself has weight. Even though I was the only one there, I felt watched. Not in a ghostly way, but as if the forest itself was aware of me. Like I was a visitor in a place that didn't want me. The cabin's door creaked as I opened it. Inside, the air was cold and smelled of wood and damp earth. The floorboards were rough under my feet, uneven in places, and the walls had small cracks where the wood had shrunk with age. There was an old wood stove in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, and a bunk bed against the far wall. Dust covered everything, and spiderwebs hung in the corners. I set my bag down, lit a small lantern I brought, and started unpacking. I had brought food, water, a basic first aid kit, a flashlight with fresh batteries, a pocket knife, and a few books. No phone signal here. That was part of the point.
No distractions.
Just me and the wilderness. That first evening, I made a fire outside on the small stone fire pit near the porch. The flames crackled and sent sparks up into the sky, smoke swirling around me. The temperature dropped fast as the sun disappeared behind the trees. The night air was cool, damp. I wrapped myself in a jacket and sat close to the fire, listening to the sounds of the forest. Somewhere nearby, an owl hooted. A branch snapped far off. Leaves rustled in the wind. I tried to focus on the crackling fire, to calm the nervous energy bubbling in my chest. Around midnight, I decided to head inside. The fire had died down to embers, and the chill was creeping into my bones. I gathered the ashes carefully, making sure the fire was completely out, then closed the cabin door behind me. Inside, the cabin felt different, smaller, more enclosed. The darkness was thick and solid, even with my lantern lit. Shadows stretched and flickered on the walls. I double-checked the windows, making sure they were shut tight. The old wooden latch on the door clicked securely in place. I laid down on the bottom bunk. The mattress was thin and lumpy, the sheets rough and clean but smelled faintly of mildew. I wrapped my jacket around me, feeling the cold seep through the walls. I tried to read a little, but my eyes kept drifting to the window. The moon was bright, casting silver light on the treetops and the lake's surface. Then I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind, but it was a slow, steady thumping, like footsteps, heavy footsteps moving through the forest just beyond the clearing around the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding. The sound was deliberate, slow, almost methodical. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or rabbit. Something bigger, something walking on 2 legs. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a bear or a moose. Bears could be curious, but they usually avoided humans. Still, the sound continued. Step, pause, step, pause. Getting closer. My breath quickened. I reached for my flashlight and shone it toward the window, sweeping the beam across the trees. Nothing. Just thick trunks, shadows, and branches swaying in the moonlight. The thumping stopped abruptly. I stayed awake for hours after that, listening to every sound. The forest was alive with noise. Insects buzzing, leaves rustling, distant water lapping against the shore. But nothing else came near the cabin. The next day, I tried to shake the feeling of unease. I chopped some firewood, gathered water from the lake with a small bucket, and walked a little way down the dirt path that led from the cabin into the woods. The trees were thick and close, the ground soft with fallen leaves and pine needles. I noticed old animal tracks near the shore, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and strange scratch marks on a few trees, deep and jagged. I spent most of the day exploring the area near the cabin, trying to remind myself why I wanted to be here. The peace, the quiet, the escape. But every now and then, that strange feeling crept back in, the sense of being watched. Like eyes hidden somewhere just beyond sight, tracking my every move. That evening, I made sure to build the fire bigger and closer to the cabin. I kept the lantern lit inside, too, and set a small kitchen knife within reach on the table. I ate cold beans from a can and dry crackers, the food tasting bland but comforting in its familiarity. The night passed slower than the first. Every sound was louder in the dark. The wind through the trees sometimes sounded like whispers. Branches creaked and groaned as if the forest itself was stretching or settling. Around 2 a.m., I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. Step, step, step.
No pause. Fast.
Brisk, like someone walking quickly around the edge of the clearing. I held my breath, my eyes glued to the window. A shape moved just beyond the tree line, a shadow among shadows. I couldn't make out details, just a tall, dark figure. It stopped for a moment and then disappeared. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The following day, I decided to stay closer to the cabin, avoiding wandering too far into the woods. I inspected the cabin's perimeter, checking the door and windows for any signs of entry or damage. Nothing. No footprints in the dirt near the porch. No scratches on the wood. But when I walked near the back, I found something unsettling. In the soft earth near the edge of the trees, I saw fresh footprints, large, heavy, and distinctly human. They were deep impressions, like whoever made them was wearing boots. The footprints circled the cabin slowly, never approaching closer than 10 feet, but always staying just at the edge of the clearing. I felt a cold wave of fear then, sharper than before. Someone had been around the cabin. Not an animal, person. But why? The cabin was remote, miles from any road or other houses. No one else was supposed to be here. I spent the afternoon inside, locking the door and windows. I kept the fire burning high, even during the day, as a small comfort. The forest outside seemed quieter, too quiet. The usual birdsong and rustling were missing, replaced by a heavy silence. That night, I barely dared to move. Every creak and groan of the cabin sounded like footsteps. The wind outside had died down, leaving the forest still and heavy. I sat in the corner with the lantern and my knife, waiting for dawn. Hours passed. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard it again. The footsteps, slow and deliberate, walking in circles around the cabin. But this time, they stopped, just outside the door. I pressed my back against the wall, breath shallow, eyes fixed on the door. Then came a long, slow scraping sound, like something being dragged across the wood. The sound moved around the cabin, tracing the walls. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I just waited, every muscle tense. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps faded away. The forest slowly woke, birds beginning to call again. The first pale light crept in through the window. I didn't sleep again. By the morning, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to stay. I packed quickly, double-checking my things and locking the cabin as best I could. The forest was still, almost holding its breath as I drove away. The trip back was a blur of tense glances in the rearview mirror and fast, careful driving on the winding roads. When I finally reached the highway and the noise of cars and life, I felt like I had The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and pine needles when I arrived at the cabin. It sat deep in the woods, far from any main road or sign of civilization. The gravel driveway was narrow and winding, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to crowd closer the further I drove. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows between the trunks. I had been looking forward to this weekend alone, away from the noise and rush of the city, a chance to unplug, clear my head, and maybe do a little writing. The cabin itself looked older than I expected. It was built from rough, weathered logs, some of them cracked and darkened with age. The roof sagged slightly in places, and a thin plume of smoke drifted lazily from the stone chimney. A small porch wrapped around one side, cluttered with old rocking chairs and a rusty metal bucket. The windows were dusty and streaked with rain, reflecting the forest's gloom back at me. I pulled my bag out of the car and locked the doors behind me, stepping onto the creaking wooden steps. The silence was immediate and heavy. No birdsong, No rustling animals, just the wind, whispering softly through the trees. Inside, the cabin smelled of mildew, wood smoke, and something faintly sour, like forgotten food left in a damp room. The floorboards groaned beneath my boots as I crossed the small living area. There was a stone fireplace against one wall, cold and empty, with a few blackened logs piled beside it. A sagging couch with faded cushions sat nearby, its fabric torn in places. The kitchen was tiny and cramped, with a metal sink stained with rust, and cupboards that creaked ominously when I opened them. I found a few cans of beans and some boxed cereal shoved to the back of a shelf, but no fresh food. There was a well-worn wood stove in the corner, its door sealed shut and cold to the touch. I decided to explore the rest of the cabin before settling in. The hallway was narrow, lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling by exposed wires. The light flickered weakly. The bedroom was small, with a rickety bed frame and a thin mattress covered in a threadbare quilt. The mattress smelled stale and musty, like it hadn't been aired out in years. I pushed open the creaky window to let in some fresh air, and the cold evening breeze carried in the scent of pine and damp earth. Outside, the woods looked darker and more tangled than ever, shadows thickening beneath the trees. I realized I hadn't checked the bathroom yet. It was a tiny room, with cracked tiles on the floor and a sink that dripped steadily from the faucet. The toilet was old and stained, and there was no hot water. I turned the taps in frustration, accepting the cold splash. I hadn't expected comfort, but this was rougher than I'd imagined. Still, I was here for the solitude. I pulled out a box of matches from my bag and started a fire in the fireplace. The dry logs caught quickly, and soon warm light flickered across the room, chasing away the gloom. I sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, my notebook on my lap, but my thoughts kept drifting. The quiet was too intense, like the forest was holding its breath, watching. Every creak of the cabin, every shift of the wind, seemed amplified in the silence. Night fell fully. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, and the cabin was plunged into darkness between the flickers of the fire. Outside, the woods pressed close against the walls, dense and still. I thought I heard something. Maybe a branch scraping against the side of the cabin, or an animal moving through the underbrush. But when I looked, there was nothing, just blackness and the faint rustle of leaves. I tried to write, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, my ears picked up on every small sound. The cabin seemed alive with noises I hadn't noticed before. The slow drip of water somewhere behind a wall, the settling groan of the wooden beams, the scuttling of tiny feet in the floorboards. My skin prickled as I imagined mice or rats nesting in the walls or under the floor. I told myself it was normal for an old cabin like this to be noisy, but the unease grew heavier with every minute. Later, the wind picked up and began to howl through the trees. It rattled the windows and made the old wooden walls creak and moan. The porch swing outside squeaked rhythmically as it swung back and forth in the gusts. I wrapped the blanket tighter and moved closer to the fire. Outside, the darkness was impenetrable. I could barely see the outline of the trees against the sky. At some point, I heard a sharp knock on the front door. It was quick, maybe 2 taps, soft but definite. My heart jumped, and I froze. No one was supposed to be here. The nearest house was miles away, and I had left my phone in the car because there was no signal. The knock came again, just as soft and quick. I waited, holding my breath, but nothing followed. I didn't open the door. Instead, I sat in the dim light, watching the shadows stretch and shrink with the fire. My mind raced with possibilities. Could it have been an animal? A branch banging against the door? Or was someone out there, watching? The thought was enough to send a shiver down my spine. I didn't dare check. The hours dragged on. The fire burned lower and lower, until only glowing embers remained. The wind outside settled, but the quiet was heavier now, almost suffocating. I decided I needed to sleep, but the bed looked so uncomfortable and smelled so stale that I wasn't sure I could. I lay down anyway, pulling the quilt over me, ears straining for any sound. I must have drifted off because I woke to a soft scratching noise. It was coming from the wall behind my head, faint but steady. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The scratching continued, slow and deliberate, like claws scraping against wood. I reached for my flashlight and aimed it at the wall. There was nothing visible, no holes, no gaps. But the sound kept coming. My mind started thinking of all the ways the cabin could be falling apart, of animals or insects nesting in the walls. But the noise was too persistent to be just that. I felt trapped, small and helpless in this ancient building surrounded by dark woods. The next morning, I woke early to gray skies and drizzle tapping against the windows. The cabin looked even grimmer in the daylight. I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, letting the damp air wash over me. The forest seemed less threatening in the light, but still quiet and closed off. No birds, no squirrels, just the soft patter of rain on leaves. I decided to explore the area around the cabin to clear my head. The ground was soft and muddy beneath my boots. Trees crowded close, their trunks covered with moss and lichen. Fallen branches littered the forest floor, damp and slick. I walked slowly, taking in the smells of earth and pine, the faint sound of a distant creek. I found an old rusted barrel and what looked like a broken-down shed covered in vines. The place felt abandoned, like no one had been here for years. Back at the cabin, I inspected the outside walls more closely. The logs were cracked and splintered, with patches of rot near the base. The windows had small cracks, and the porch steps creaked dangerously underfoot. I realized the place hadn't been maintained for decades. It was a miracle it still stood. I went back inside, checked the firewood pile, and brought some logs inside to keep the fire going. The cabin felt colder now, even with the fire. I decided I would pack up and leave first thing the next morning. That evening, the cabin grew darker faster. The rain stopped, but the clouds never parted. The fire in the hearth was the only light, casting flickering shadows that made the walls seem to move. I sat in the chair, staring into the flames, trying to keep my mind off the strange noises I was certain I still heard. Soft footsteps, the creak of floorboards, faint tapping on the walls. Suddenly, a loud bang shook the cabin. It sounded like something heavy had hit the side of the building. My heart slammed in my chest as I jumped to my feet, shining the flashlight outside through the window. Nothing moved in the shadows. The trees stood still, their branches dripping with rainwater. I forced myself to breathe slowly, telling myself it was probably a falling branch or a rock washed loose by the rain. But deep down, I knew the cabin was not safe. It was old and fragile, and there was something about this place that set my nerves on edge. I spent the rest of the night listening to every sound, barely sleeping, watching the fire until it was just embers again. Morning couldn't come soon enough. The first light, I packed my things, moving quickly. I checked every room one last time, making sure I hadn't left anything behind. The cabin was still and silent. I locked the door, feeling a final chill as I turned the key. Outside, the forest was quiet, the damp earth steaming in the cool morning air. I started down the driveway toward my car, not looking back. The cabin disappeared into the trees behind me, swallowed by the forest shadows. Driving away, I realized I wouldn't be coming back. The cabin wasn't haunted by ghosts or spirits, but by time and neglect. It was a place forgotten, swallowed by the wilderness,